Okay, welcome everybody. Can I welcome members, officers, guests and members of the public to today's meeting of the London Assembly Transport Committee. Now, our main item today will be hopefully a very interesting discussion on shared mobility. But first we have some short items of business. So first of all, please make sure that your electronic devices are switched off or on silent mode to avoid unnecessary interruptions. And can I start by asking our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence today.
Great, thank you. Item 2 on the agenda is declarations of interest. So can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare?
I should probably declare that I'm a recent member of Zipcar.
Okay, any members of Zipcar? I ought to declare myself in that case. Okay, thank you. Yeah, actually I have Lime app as well. We'll assume members have various consumer relationships with the guests.
No consumer relationships.
More seriously, I need to declare that I, for some years, was a board member of CoMoUK, who are one of our guests in the second meeting. I'm no longer that, and I have been for some time. So, item 3 on the agenda is minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the Transport Committee meetings held on the 29th of June 2022 and 12th of July to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you very much. Item 4 is our summary list of actions. Can we note the completed, closed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence received?
Noted.
Thank you very much. Item 5 is actions taken under delegated authority. Can we note the action taken by me as chair of the committee under delegated authority in consultation with the deputy chair and party group leads to agree the letters to the Mayor of London regarding the ultra-low emission zone consultation and the Central London bus review consultation?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. And thank you, members, for agreeing all those strong recommendations. So we now move on to our first item of business, which is a 2-part question and answer session on shared mobility. Shared bikes, shared cars, shared scooters now, and the well-known bike sharing scheme that is run by TfL. We're going to start by talking to 5 representatives of operators of these kinds of schemes. Each of them is going to have 5 minutes to tell us about their scheme, its impact it has on the city and its potential, as well as any potential problems it might be causing. And then our members will ask some questions to each of the guests once they've all given their presentations. Our second panel will include people from Transport for London, someone from CoMoUK, who I mentioned a moment ago, who represents the operators as a whole and shared transport as an industry, and from academic experts as well. So can I welcome our first panel of guests, please? Today we've got Alan Clarke, who is the Senior Director of Policy at Lime. We've got Kate Hinton, who's Public Affairs Advisor at Zipcar. We have Caroline Seton, who is the Head of Growth at HumanForest. We have Georgia Yexley, who is the General Manager for Tier Mobility in the South East. And we have David Eddington, who is the Head of Cycle Hire for TfL. I'll introduce our next panel of guests when we bring them in. Just to start off then, I'll go left to right. Each of you has 5 minutes to talk to us briefly about your scheme and its impacts. And I'll give you a warning when you've got 1 minute left.
Thank you very much. Great. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for the invite to be here today. It's brilliant to be part of this panel and this discussion. So my name's Alan, as you heard from Sian. So I am the Senior Director of Policy for Line for Northern, Eastern Europe and Israel. It's a slightly unusual region, but there we are. And I've been with the company around about 4 years. So I joined just before we first launched our first services in London back in 2018. So what I'm hoping to do today is to give a bit of perspective of the journey that we've been on, both globally and also in the UK in that time, and hopefully be able to give you some insight into some of the challenges we face, some of the issues with the service, and also some of the opportunities that it provides. So as I said, we launched in London back in 2018. We were founded about 18 months before that, so right at the start of 2017, and we began by offering shared e-bikes in 2 London boroughs, so in the boroughs of Brent and Ealing. Since then, we've grown to add shared e-scooters to that service as part of the TfL trial, so we're one of the 3 contracted operators in the TfL e-scooter service. And we've also grown to offering our e-bike service in another 8 London boroughs. So we have deployment contracts now across 9 London boroughs for e-bikes, and then in addition to the 10 London boroughs who operate in the e-scooter trial. And across that time, because we've been in London for sort of 4 years, we've built up quite a healthy consumer base. So we now have over 500,000 users in London, which is really encouraging. It's really great to see that number of people who want to download the app, want to have the option to use an e-scooter or an e-bike. And that has allowed people using our service to now make more than 7 million journeys in the capital since we launched back in 2018. So we've grown through that time from quite small beginnings of just a couple of boroughs to something that's relatively substantial. And we now play quite a big role in trying to encourage and offer people the chance to make zero emission journeys, either on our e-scooters or on our shared e-bikes. In terms of the types of journeys that we see, they vary a little bit between e-scooters and e-bikes. It's partially because of the way those services are regulated. As I'm sure we'll get into, those services are regulated in slightly different ways. There's different requirements, and that leads to slightly different journeys being made on those respective vehicle types. But in general, we see people making journeys on average somewhere between sort of 13 to 17 minutes for both modes. Typically, the average journey for e-bikes over the last year has been a bit longer, so more up to sort of around about 20 minutes, something like that. E-scooters are a little bit lower. In terms of what we see currently and in terms of trends, we saw an enormous change in our business, like many businesses did and like everyone did during the pandemic. We pulled all of our services for about 6 weeks, whilst we sort of took stock to work out what this was going to mean and what it meant for how we needed to operate. But when we put our services back out onto the streets and started re-engaging with the boroughs that we served, we actually saw during the pandemic that there was a much increased demand for the types of services that we offer. Largely that's due to things like social distancing, desire for people to be outside, and also restriction of public transport services. So what's been so great for us to see since the pandemic, however, is that as lots of those other things have come back, as people's lives have gone back to, in inverted commas, normal, we've actually seen lots of that demand stick with us. So now we are actually seeing the biggest demand that we've ever seen for our services. And of those 7 million rides that I talked about earlier, a substantial portion have happened within the last 8 or 9 months. Our busiest day was the 19th of August on the day of the tube strike a couple of weeks ago. It's the biggest ever. It's the busiest day we've ever had. We want to work with everyone here today, different boroughs, the other operators on the panel, to try to make sure that as many people as possible can use shared emission-free services, and to try to make sure that the services that we provide give people a convenient way to do that, but without impacting too much onto other people's lives, onto non-users of the service or local authorities' aims and goals.
Thank you very much. That was very prompt. Thank you, Alan. Right, moving on to Kate Hinton from Zipcar.
Hi, thanks so much for the opportunity to contribute to today's meeting. We really welcome the fact that you're looking at shared mobility in London and the role that it can play. We believe at Zipcar that shared mobility has a key role to play in delivering the Mayor's transport strategy, particularly reducing congestion and improving air quality. So what I'm going to do in this very brief moment is kind of cover a brief history of Zipcar, some of the services that we provide, the environmental and social benefits, and some of the challenges, but also the opportunities we see that London could tap into more of. And so in terms of the history of Zipcar, there's one common theme to everything that we do. We're very committed to delivering sustainable travel in cities across the world, including London. And our mission is to enable simple and responsible urban living. It's at the heart of everything that we do. So we've been committed to doing this for literally 18 years in London now. We are now the largest car park provider in London, and we have 450,000 members, growing at 20% per annum. So one of the key areas for us is our low emission fleet, and this is something we've been committed to for over 11 years now. which is when we first launched our hybrid vehicles, and this was just the beginning. We now have 400 all-electric vehicles, and we also launched our vision to be all-electric by 2025. And we continue to love operating in London. In terms of some of the social and environmental benefits of car clubs, it does provide one of the best ways in which you can cut down on congestion. As we all know, it's a kind of key behaviour change model. So, for example, once people get rid of their private car, they're more likely to take public transport, cycle and walk. But they're more likely to sell their car if they know there's an alternative for when those journeys that they need to take by car, whether it's heavy goods or transporting, say, young children or the elderly or late night trips, can be done if there is a backup there for them. And car sharing plays a key role in doing that. So in terms of cutting congestion, according to CoMo's recent survey, one car club can basically take 24 cars off the road. So it's a really key way to cutting congestion. 30% of car club members use a bike 3 times a week. That compares to 9% for the average Londoner. And the environmental benefits, well, the fleets generally are very low emission or zero emission. Their emissions are 26% CO2 emissions lower than the average car. The ULEZ compliant, and there are 12% of car clubs are EV compared to 1% of the private fleet. And that's just some of the environmental benefits. In terms of social benefits, it's one of the most affordable ways to access a car. For example, you can save up to £1,500 per year compared to owning a private vehicle. And it's also one of the most affordable ways to accessing an EV. So in terms of what we are providing in London at the moment, we have a fleet of 3,000 low and zero emission vehicles, providing members with quick, affordable and reliable access to a vehicle 24/7. As I said, we have 400 low-emission vehicles, we have hybrid vehicles, and they all comply with the ULEZ. And since we launched our fleet of EVs, we've now had 80,000 of our members driving electric vehicles. And I think the other key area in terms of our service is that we fully integrate car clubs into the existing transport system. So we provide cars where journeys where public transport, cycling and walking just aren't possible, whether it's transport having goods to journeys that need to take place late at night, for example. In terms of our geographic spread, we're completely across the whole of London for our round-trip service, and then we have 15 boroughs which also have our flex service. We have cars and vans within 10 minutes walk of wherever Londoner lives, and most of our vehicles do tend to be in central London, and we've recently expanded our flex service to Ealing and Richmond. And we also have 13,000 business members, including some local authorities such as Croydon and Brent, who use our fleets for business purposes, and these vehicles are then made available to local residents and businesses outside of office hours. So in terms of our business model, just very briefly on this, we just want to make sure that we cover all journey types. So round trip is back to base and long journeys, flex services for those short quick up and pick up journeys. So they're really kind of complementary, and we've discovered that when we introduced our flex service into our fleet, we saw a massive uplift. And that's because members felt very confident then that they could do all their journeys through a car club as and when they needed it. Very conscious of time. In terms of the issues and problems we've experienced operating in London, we take pride, obviously, working closely with local London boroughs and obviously London councils, TfL and the GLA. However, there are some challenges. We welcome TfL's recent publication of its car club commitments. However, there's a lot more needs to be done. We think that there's a lack of vision and a sense of what London really wants to achieve from shared transport, including car clubs. Many cities across Europe have now overtaken London and are doing really well with their shared transport. For example, the European Shared Mobility Index recently flagged that London now lies 8th compared to other European cities, with the number of available shared vehicles and 6th for shared cars. London's shared car fleet is nearly half the size of Berlin, which tops the table with 6,000 vehicles, with Paris and Madrid far ahead of London. There's also issues regarding the rising cost of operating and obviously the complex relationships with boroughs.
Okay, I'll have to ask you to wrap up, I'm afraid, but I'm sure we'll have more questions on quite a lot of those issues coming up in a second. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So moving on to Caroline Seton from HumanForest. You have 5 minutes, very strictly.
Thanks very much for having me. Hi, I'm Caroline. I founded HumanForest, a Dockless e-bike hire scheme 3 years ago with 2 others. Our founder and CEO, Augustine Gilastasi, came from Cabify, which was the first mobility company to offset its carbon footprint, where he was part of the founding team. The Cabify COO sits on our board. HumanForest began operating in Camden and Islington in the summer of 2020 with a 3-month trial. We then launched officially in London last year. We've grown from 200 to 1,300 e-bikes, and each e-bike is used on average 4 times per day, although in the most popular boroughs, in Islington for example, it can be up to 6 times. Our offer to London is very simple. We're the most affordable, sustainable operator, offering an agile, carbon-negative solution to shared mobility at the lowest cost to users and at no cost to council taxpayers. We operate across London with formal agreements in 5 boroughs and informal agreements in 3 more. We have 220,000 users in London. 5,000 people use the service daily, and of those, 60% do 2 trips. Normally about 1,000 new users join per day, but on the tube strike, for example, 2,000 join that day. We've done 1 million trips in London over the last year. As I mentioned, our business model is centred around affordability and sustainability. So all our users automatically get 10 minutes free cycling per day, and we charge 17p per minute after that. The 10 minutes free riding is subsidised by revenues from our partners who advertise in the app. Our partners have included Financial Times, UPS and Bloomberg. To make it more affordable, we also sell bundles, bringing the price down to 3p per minute. We've sold 5 million bundles in the last year, which is a saving of around 700,000. Through our loyalty program, we've also gamified active travel, with users automatically earning more free minutes based on how much CO2 they've avoided. And in line with the Mayor's transport strategy, this pricing has helped to embed active travel into people's daily routines, with high uptake among commuters. 70% of our trips take place during that morning and evening peak. We're carbon negative. Our operations are zero emission, and we offset our Scope 3 emissions. Just looking at some of the evidence of environmental and social benefits, our users are helping to make progress to the Mayor's London transport strategy and national zero goals and carbon targets. Collectively, they've avoided 150 tonnes of CO2 and reduced traffic congestion and noise pollution by around 50,000 trips per month. 25% of our users say if they hadn't taken HumanForest, they might have taken a car. And among those users, have spent 250,000 hours outdoors. Just lastly, looking at some of the policy changes that we'd like to see. We obviously want to work with everybody here to see continued growth in shared mobility, and particularly in dockless bikes. With the cost of living crisis and rising cost of fuel, walking and cycling should continue to be made one of the easiest and most convenient choices for everyday journeys. And for us, that means more on carriageway parking and a presumption towards it, rather than on pavement, to help minimise the impact on other London residents. Greater integration with public transport at rail, underground and bus stations, and a supportive and sensible national legal framework for shared mobility, as is planned with the Transport Bill. And, continued progress on a borough-by-borough relation, as we've done previously with MOUs and concession contracts. That concludes my intro. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was well within time. Thank you. And moving on now to Georgia Yexley from TIA. You have 5 minutes starting now.
Thank you, and equally thank you to you all for giving your attention to this important topic today. So briefly reintroducing myself, Georgia Yexley, I'm General Manager for the UK and Ireland at TIA. I've worked in micromobility for several years now, prior to joining TIA, so almost every continent and hundreds of cities supporting their micromobility aims. At TIA, TIA was founded in 2018 with a mission to achieve system and behaviour change in the transport sector. Our aim is to significantly reduce car traffic in urban environments by providing people with micromobility options. So that includes e-bikes, e-scooters and e-mopeds. So we've been founded by a climate entrepreneur. Our commitment to sustainability and helping cities achieve their own decarbonisation and climate fighting ambitions is absolutely central and core to our business. So following the recent acquisitions of 2 other micromobility operators, Nextbike and Spin, Tier now operates mixed fleets of pedal bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters, e-mopeds in both docked and dockless solutions in over 540 cities globally, with 30 million users. And we're supported by a number of commercial models to do so, including sponsorship, while we run predominantly a venture capital funded business. In London, we support over 25,000 people to take trips via sustainable transport modes monthly. We're taking part also in the e-scooter trials currently in operation across 10 boroughs and have agreements in place to provide e-bikes for residents and visitors to London to 6 boroughs. And speaking to the many cities that Tier has worked with and I personally have worked with over the years, there are none as complex and indeed as exciting as London, and as a Londoner myself, I can certainly say that is the case. Now, we know the number one reason why our customers choose to use our service in any city is ease of access and convenience. We also know that UK residents would far rather choose a more sustainable mode of transport to travel around their city in order to improve their carbon footprint, so over and above giving up eating meat or taking fewer journeys by plane. The first prompt for using shared micromobility is seeing a vehicle available on street somewhere that you need to go. We want to support Londoners in making that choice of sustainable transport easier by supporting end-to-end journeys by public and shared transport, by being the first and last mile connector to transport hubs, to people's residences, their places of work, or indeed where they would like to visit in the city. During the pandemic, we saw a shift of increasing the number of local journeys, travelling within local areas, conducting far more errands locally as people move to working from home. So according to the World Health Organization, 50% of car journeys in Europe cover less than 5 kilometres, and it's those small local journeys that aren't necessarily catered for by more mainstream modes of public transport and can certainly be moved out of the private car. This is where Londoners may be more inclined to seek a private hire vehicle and currently, take their own car if they have one, where shared micromobility operations such as scooters and e-bikes could really help achieve the modal shift that is vital to see in London. However, the inconsistent and sometimes erratic approach to shared micromobility in the capital means that access to these modes of transport for residents can sometimes feel like it comes down to a postcode lottery. The e-scooter trial has been greatly limited by the difficulty in installing parking bays and the difference in approach of each participating borough. In order for shared transport to achieve the maximum benefit and potential, you have to secure a dense level of parking locations, similar to the Santander cycle scheme. Achieving right levels of parking density delivers convenience and allows us to reach a greater level of diversity in users. However, where the e-scooter trial has had great success in the shared operational area across multiple boroughs in London, this has greatly increased our level of insight from the research that we've been able to deliver across the last 12 months. For bike share, however, we haven't been able to understand usage and demand at such a level due to the fact that approach, both on parking, SLAs, etc., varies greatly across the city, with some local authorities putting forward more formal asks for bike share services, others having a more laissez-faire approach, others declaring climate emergency without necessarily seeking solutions from the private sector to help them tackle it. The problem with this approach being Londoners and Londoners' visitors do not know where borough boundaries lie. They want to be able to take journeys across the city without restrictions, catering for convenience of use method mentioned earlier. So we thoroughly welcome the ambitious aims of the Mayor's transport strategy to achieve 80% of journeys in the capital by walking and cycling or public transport by 2030, to reduce car journeys by 28% by 2028. Shared e-mobility is a critical part of the solution to reaching those targets, and we welcome the opportunity to work in partnership with all of London to ensure these targets are reached sustainably.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
If you can wrap up there, that will have more questions for you later, I'm sure. Thank you very much. And so finally, moving on to David Eddington, who is the head of cycle hire for Transport for London, who in this context is another operator. That's how we're treating them.
Good morning. Thank you for the chance to come and talk about the Santander Cycle Hire Scheme. I'm David Eddington. I've been connected with the scheme since before Go Live. So I was part of the project team for when the project was initiated in 2009, and then we launched in 2010 with 6,000 cycles, a docked scheme at that point. And we've expanded since then to 11 boroughs, the Royal Parks and the Olympic Park. We now have 12,000 bikes, 810 docking stations comprising of 21,000 docking points where you dock your bike. Since that time, I think it's fair to say it's been hugely successful. We've now had over 119 million journeys. We've got 205,000 registered customers. And it's going from strength to strength. The last 12 months has seen every month be the best month we've had. So we've seen record numbers coming into the scheme. Particularly during the pandemic, as mentioned earlier, we saw phenomenal numbers where people were trying to do that social distancing. The scheme is funded by customer revenue and a 6.25 million a year Santander sponsorship deal, which allows us last year to break even. In terms of where we're going next, hopefully next Monday we'll be launching e-bikes. So the scheme will encompass 500 docked e-bikes from, all being well, Monday morning, and we will then be a kind of a wider micromobility offering, I guess, from TfL's perspective. So we're really looking forward to that. We also, it's fair to say, we'll be changing our pricing structure from Monday. We'll be doing away with the, some would say, complicated 24-hour access period that we have now and going to a single trip, which will be £1.65, the equivalent of a bus fare. So the scheme is going from strength to strength. We'd like to be in more boroughs. Obviously, our funding position makes that difficult at the moment. But yeah, it's been something that's been great to be involved in. It's the best job I've ever had, and the scheme is something we're really proud of.
Okay, thank you. That was very brief and concise. I'm sure we'll have further questions for you, particularly on the changes that are coming up. Members, we've saved a little bit of time because everyone was on time, so that's great. We now have about 40 minutes for questions from our members of the committee, and I'd like to hand over first to Deputy Chair Caroline Pidgeot.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you for that overview of position from your different organisations. Could I just pick up a couple of specific things with individuals? So if I start with Alan and Caroline, maybe Georgia as well. None of you have mentioned cargo bikes, e-cargo bikes. Are they just not ever going to be part of your scheme, or is it something you're looking at? I know there's a couple of pilots I'm looking at. There's certainly one near me in East Dulwich where we see these cargo bikes, and there is a cargo bike share scheme in East London. Let's start with you, Alan.
So firstly, they're brilliant. So we use them all the time as part of to service our e-bike fleet and e-scooter fleet. So we have people travelling around on cargo bikes, particularly in central London, in order to try to alleviate any issues with things like sending e-vans out in terms of their impact on congestion. So we use cargo bikes all the time. The reality for us on it is that it is something that we're looking at, and certainly looking at other vehicle types that fit the requirement to give people potentially the ability to carry luggage or shopping or essentially more stuff on a vehicle that you can't do on an e-bike or an e-scooter, really aiming at replacing the car very, very directly, is something we are looking at. But at the moment, the cost of an e-cargo bike to buy and then maintain and put out on the streets, commercially, it's a really tough thing to get going. I don't know, and Caroline can talk to it from obviously from their perspective, but I think lots of these schemes that we see tend to be public-private partnerships, and often that's to do with the fact that commercially it is difficult for using the type of model that we have in order to try and deploy those bikes and then get the levels of usage we'd need to be able to make that a reasonable investment. But it is something we're interested in, and we do have some products that are designed to try to overcome that issue. Just cargo bikes for the moment for us are probably a little bit out of the scope of what we're looking at.
Caroline?
Yeah, I'll echo what Alan said. It's out of scope for us at the moment, but we are looking sort of for a halfway house at the moment with a box on the back of our existing bike. So that's an addition that we'll be able to easily roll out across the existing fleet, but it's more of a box that you could put your shopping in, for example, because the basket at the front can be a bit
too small. Yeah.
Too small, yeah.
Anyone else want to comment on cargo bikes, e-cargo bikes?
I will just, second what has been said so far, but add that we have got some experience operating cargo bikes across our Next Bike side of our business as well. We're also looking at piloting cargo bike fleets in some of the other cities that we operate in, other capital cities such as Paris. But as Alan rightly spoke to, where we have run those operations, it has been in partnership with the public sector, generally with some availability of capital or revenue funding to support those business journeys and the slightly longer journeys that are enabled through cargo bike services.
Okay. And David, TfL, any plans? I think I've asked about it.
We will be, as part of the e-bike launch, we'll be launching e-cargo bikes for our battery replacement and servicing. So we'll have 8 e-cargo bikes on the streets on Monday morning.
So 8, did you say? Great. Yep. So you're going to see how that goes and potentially expand. Oh, that's really, really good. Okay, that's interesting to hear. The other, Georgia, can I pick up with you? You're the only person who mentioned e-mopeds. Now, clearly you're operating them in other cities. Where else are you operating those? And is that something you might consider in London in the future?
So it's complex. Operating e-mopeds indeed. However, one similarity that we do have in London currently is the requirement for driving licence checks for e-scooter riders. So that level of compliance also carries over for the e-mopeds. We largely operate e-mopeds in Germany, which is a major market for us. It's unlikely that we'll be looking to launch e-mopeds anytime soon in London, just simply the complexity of launching any service and the hill that we still have to climb to enable people to move to much more sustainable forms of transport, such as e-bikes or e-scooters.
Do any other members on the panel have any plans around e-mopeds? I've seen them myself in Paris and places. Caroline?
Yeah, I should have mentioned really in our overview, we have launched a small trial of e-mopeds. So we have 100 e-mopeds and we're doing it very slowly. It's for only business use currently, so we have a partnership with delivery companies like Deliveroo, who then sign up on behalf of their members. It's not something that we're looking to roll out to the general public just yet, and as I say, it's very slow with quite a few checks and balances in place around getting those users on board. I can give you some stats.
Is that in London?
In London,
okay,
yes.
That would be interesting. Thank you. Now, a few of you have touched on the issue of working with other authorities, the complexities. I think Caroline, you were, was it Caroline who was talking about it, and Kate as well? You were talking about the issues. Now, clearly, there are many London boroughs. People think coming to London it's straightforward, and it isn't. Are there still huge barriers with working with boroughs? And what would you suggest to improve it? What about London councils as a body? Are they sort of working and coordinating well? I'm going to start with you, Kate.
Thank you. Yes, I would say the complexities are still there. Obviously, there's many boroughs to work with, and we work hard to work with all of them. I think it's not just the working relationship we have with them, but it's also coming at it from a member perspective. So there's all the different parking arrangements that the members need to navigate. They don't necessarily know whether they've actually gone from one borough to another in terms of the different parking arrangements. So that's one layer of complexity. There's ways in which things could be made more simple, for example. So if we are thinking of expanding particularly our flex service into new boroughs or looking at renewal contracts, it's having some simple standard way of having contracts across London, which I think would help save borough time, but also our time as operators as well. And then there's another layer of complexity in terms of parking charges themselves. So we've got obviously EV vehicles, which residents, for example, get free parking permits for, but we as car club operators don't. So there's just lots of nuances across London, which obviously we're working hard to work with, but there's an awful lot more that could be done to make things simple, and obviously there are solutions out there.
Does anyone else want to comment on working with the boroughs and TfL?
Yes, if I may.
Yes.
We have a great experience working with TfL, London Councils, boroughs amongst the e-scooter trial. And one of the reasons that it works so well is a collective clarity on the aims of that trial and what we're wanting to achieve together. Just given the sheer number of stakeholders that there are in the transport space in London as a whole, what we desperately need is a collective vision for what we're trying to achieve for kind of walking, cycling and our transport strategies across London boroughs, the GLA, TfL, London councils indeed. What's the collective vision for London and how is everybody playing their part to get there? That would really go a long way to help kind of bring a shared approach to the table. I think operationally, one of the challenges, similarly in the sustainable transport space, is the equity of space. The approach to operations requirements for collection of bikes, for example, vary really drastically from borough to borough. And what that means is it becomes a lot more complex and difficult to run your operations smoothly and focus and prioritise the right things on the street if you're responding to a really mixed bag of operational SLAs, depending where you are in the city. The other opportunity is expanding the reach for users. I think we tend to focus on the complexity of operations and maybe not speak enough about what that means to end users and their ability to actually use these services. With a collective approach and a citywide approach, you actually open up these services to a greater number of people, a greater diversity of people. At the moment, these services tend to be available where there is resource available in local authorities to work with us. We only launch these services in partnership with local authorities. That requires resource and buy-in on their side. So a citywide approach would go a long way to supporting that actually becoming much more accessible for a greater number of people and much easier to get out of your car and use one of these options.
Does anyone else want to come in on this point?
Could I add something to that?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so we also, I mean, I echo everything that George just said there, but we also work, obviously, and I work quite closely personally in a lot of different cities across Europe, across down into Israel, as I mentioned before, Eastern Europe and the Nordic countries. And the comparison is really, really clear between those cities who have got an organised way of delivering these types of services, of doing regulation, of planning things like parking for bikes or e-scooters or whatever at a citywide level, and those which are split into a similar organisational structure to London. So the boroughs, we work with boroughs all over London. We work with fantastic people at boroughs. Some of the boroughs are absolutely fantastic, and most people who work at boroughs have got fantastic intentions for delivering the types of services that will bring real change and encourage sustainable travel. And obviously the borough system in one sense is a great example of democratic accountability and all the things that go with that, and that's fantastic. In terms of service delivery and in terms of delivering the types of radical change that we need to address things like climate emergency, air quality in London, it's an absolutely huge blocker in order to doing that at an organised and successful way. And we've done this for kind of 4 years in London now. We've navigated through it in a relatively successful way, but the overall structure, the overall variance in terms of rules, in terms of, a user picking up a bike in Camden and wanting to take it to another borough. Camden's a great success story in terms of the number of people who've used our service. We've worked with them closely for many, many years. If another borough all of a sudden decides that actually they don't want a bike coming across that border and wants to stop that, then Camden's success story goes up in smoke. That's the reality of the type of model that we have currently in London. It's a huge depressive force on the demand for services I think that most of us here offer. I don't know if anyone would disagree with that. But that's, it's a huge problem from that perspective. So from our perspective, we would love to see something like the model that we have on the e-scooter side, involving all boroughs in London, replicated across the board, because it just gives a much more long-term stability, consumer confidence and consumer understanding. And we think that would deliver much quicker change.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave my questions there, Chair.
Thank you. I was going to come to Assemblymember Baker next, but should I instead pass over to Assemblymember McCartney? Thank you.
I think my supplementary probably follows on from this question. And that was obviously we can see with all of these, whether it's Zipcar, cycle hire schemes, they tend to be concentrated in inner London boroughs. And if the Mayor's transport strategy is to work, we need to do more in outer London. So those difficulties with individual boroughs, is there a difference between inner and outer London boroughs that's stopping you? Or is it just that in outer London boroughs, more people are, for example, used to their cars, therefore they're less likely to look for a shared mobility vehicle? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we've been very much focused in central London, but we are launching in Kingston and Seton at the end of this month. So we see there's a huge opportunity down there, but it's obviously you need to look at it differently and how we're going to position bikes to get people onto the service. But there's a huge proportion of people living in those boroughs that do own a car. It's some of the highest car ownership in London. So it's just a different strategy, and it's going to be an evolution really to how we can help those people drive the modal shift. But we'll be working in partnership with those boroughs to try and get uptake across the residents.
Hi, yes, I mean, we absolutely acknowledge there's a big difference between in and out of London, and we have obviously concentrated in and out of London because that's where the huge benefits can be achieved in terms of getting people out of their cars. It's trickier to get people out of their cars and out of London because there's less choice in terms of alternatives, which is where I think it goes back down to George's point, and we've been saying this for some time. If we had a clear vision for what we wanted to achieve and clear targets in terms of the uptake for what we want to achieve in terms of both car clubs, both in terms of cycle hire, all sorts of other forms of micromobility, we could then piece that together and say, well, actually, in outer London, we need to invest whatever it is. We need policies that will enable people to uptake these vehicles or alternative modes of transport in outer London. And then we can then work back to what the policies are needed to be able to achieve that growth. But without that vision, that single goal of what it is that we're working towards, it's difficult to piece all this together. So in outer London, for example, we'd need more policies to encourage people to make the shift to car clubs, incentives for growth, whether it's kind of free bays or whether it's, for example, like in Edinburgh, they're allowing for free parking for car clubs. There's also examples of what other cities have done. For example, I think in Germany they introduced a whole sort of mandate around that car clubs could have cheaper parking than, say, private cars. We need to learn from what other cities have done to really enable the growth that can occur both in inner and outer London.
Obviously, there is more road space in out of London, so you would think that those issues, space for car clubs, for example, or docking stations or areas for bikes, would actually be less of a problem than it would be in inner London. But can I just check? It's not the attitudes of outer London authorities that's stopping you, is it? Or is it just that there's no great scheme that people are all wedded to and are setting targets for?
I think that's true. That is true to a large degree. Although I think I would point as an example though on something like the e-scooter trial, which is an example, and I believe all boroughs were invited to take part in that as part of a London-wide scheme. And I think the only borough which is currently part of it, which you would class as being in outer London, is probably Richmond. I think in terms of the sort of the outer half of that borough. I think of the remaining boroughs that are involved in the e-scooter trial, which was an option for boroughs to opt in and join that trial. I think they're effectively all in what you would probably term as in central London, or at least connecting to central London. So yeah, I think there is behavioural stuff in there, but it is also probably a point that there is some approach that suggests that if everyone drives, then we don't need an e-scooter trial. Okay. But obviously, within time, to solve some of the issues that we've got, we probably do need to move past that kind of mindset.
And just speaking to the comment about kind of availability of space, I think that's absolutely true. There are differences in infrastructure, of course, across boroughs as well that do influence the uptake of these services. One of the things that we do hear cited often from local authorities in the will to kind of move private parking space towards shared spaces is the financial incentive to keep it as a parking space, that these are forms of income for local authorities to have paid parking spaces on the street, and there is a fear that that will negatively affect the financial status of local authorities in giving over road space to shared transport. So there are some structural issues in funding that are also facing local authorities in making these decisions.
Can I just clarify something with Kate Hinton from Zipcar, if that's all right? Am I right that most boroughs, and I know it varies across boroughs, are charging more for a car club space than for a normal controlled parking zone space? Is that a general pattern?
I mean, obviously the parking charges do tend to vary according to each borough, but yes, the charges are more, particularly from an EV point of view.
Thank you for that. Cheers. Right, so moving over to the Conservative group, I think I have Nick Rogers leading on some questions.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I've got some questions specifically around dockless bikes, but they do the questions do actually follow from what we're talking about, because I understand on dockless bikes there has been an attempt to deal with some of the problems of working from borough to borough. There's a TfL code of practice and a proposed bylaw. I wonder maybe Georgia, if you want to kick off the code of practice for dockless bikes. Have you found it useful in dealing with some of the pushback that some residents do give to dockless bike schemes?
It's useful to a degree, absolutely. So we do abide by the code of practice. We've also kind of taken it upon ourselves to form what we call a responsible operations agreement to provide a little bit more of a detailed approach as to how we run operations to all boroughs. I think we've all spoken to the fact that people don't know where borough boundaries are, so it is inevitable that bikes will be ridden outside of our operating area. And so we're kind of proactively in touch around what we do to rectify that, how we educate users, what we do on street to kind of reallocate and redistribute those bikes. So those kind of practical measures are useful. What the Code of Conduct doesn't do is bring forward that necessarily doesn't bring forward every borough actually saying, okay, we're going to allow access to dockless bikes through the measure of this practice. There isn't currently a regulatory environment that enables a citywide approach. So the code of practice is somewhat there to help guide, but it's not a formal agreement. So operators are actually taking it upon themselves to bring those forward as well. The bylaw has been spoken of for quite some years now. There's some incredible hard work that's gone into that from colleagues at TfL as well as CoMoUK. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get every borough to agree to that bylaw. That's what has unfortunately caused it not to come forward. So it's a lack of consensus that an agreement, probably more from the local authority side, on the way that these are going to be brought about and the methods by which they're going to be brought about. So that puts us in the position of kind of coming back to those individual one-on-one agreements where we're often citing, and I think we all cite the code of practice, the bylaw. We offer up readily agreement to those terms, but it still comes down to individual agreements with bikes in particular. For the e-scooter trial, very different environment. The governance is clear. It's very rigorous, both at the national level, but even more so at the local level in London. I think I can probably speak on behalf of all three operators in the e-scooter space to say that the governance on the e-scooter London trial is by far the most complex and rigorous than anything we're seeing, not just nationally, but internationally. So very different environments.
And with the bylaw, you're saying that it's not been possible to get agreement from all local authorities in London. What kind of pushback are you getting? I don't know if other operators want to jump in on this as well.
Well, I think I would speak again to some of the concerns around giving up space that currently provides funding to local authorities. That is certainly heard time and time again. It's often also why we see local authorities requesting financial contributions from operators to provide sustainable transport options, which of course has impacts on our ability to run commercially sustainable operations. If we see, that levied across 33 London boroughs, it becomes really untenable to run operations in the city. So these kind of structural financial concerns, I think, are a large part of the concerns that we see kind of levied back. Now, of course, there is also concern around road space or vulnerable road users, as is often mentioned. I think that the ideal scenario there is to make sure that we're actually consulting with those groups, that there's clarity on the way that operations are run, that SLAs are adhered to, and there is space to safely park these vehicles.
Anyone else want to jump in on dockless bikes?
Just on the bylaw, I think the other thing about it is that there's, this was discussed 4 or 5 years ago, as began, and has been discussed ever since. And there's an element of it of kind of like life is, what happens whilst you're making other plans. Because whilst the bylaw has been being discussed, the boroughs who have really wanted to embrace e-mobility, embrace cycling, have gone ahead and undertaken in some senses some really in-depth, really complicated, probably quite time-consuming and costly on their part, tender exercises to find operators, work with operators, build governance structures, and have also, as George was saying, charged operators operating fees in return for having won those contracts. I think there would be some reticence to rip up all of those contracts now to be replaced with a London-wide bylaw. And at the same time, the boroughs who never really had interest in cycle schemes anyway, and thus don't have much interest in a bylaw, still don't have much interest in a bylaw. So whilst nothing has moved on hugely in the last couple of years on it, the regulatory system has been building, and it will now take longer to dismantle that regulatory system to replace it. The final thing on the bylaw that I just wanted to add as well is that it's very important when the goal of it is to provide a London-wide basis for dockless bikes, in inverted commas. The goal of that, I think, is to provide parking areas for the types of bikes that our companies offer and to get a better organisational structure around it across every borough. That will only work if people can park bikes where they want to go to and can get them from their house, or can get them from where they want to. What we often see is an idea that, okay, we'll get one level of regulation across the city and we'll have bays and the bikes can be parked in bays. If there aren't the bays, that won't work. If we've got 50 bays across an entire borough, it probably won't work. People will still want to leave bikes outside of boroughs and outside of bays, and therefore they'll leave them there and someone has to go and get them or someone has to go and ride them out. So there's also a danger that unless we solve the wider parking issue, we probably won't solve some of the issues that we see with dockless bikes just through a bylaw alone.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So over to Assembly Member Ellie Baker.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much for your presentations. I think I might pour a bit of cold water on some of these because obviously we've been talking for about 50 minutes about in the sort of context of further and further expansion of all the modes of shared mobility is automatically a wonderful thing. Now, I'm a big fan, although I am not, as I said, a user of any of your services for other reasons. But I do want us to bring a bit of balance. I understand that for the majority of you, it's your job to advocate for it, but we do need a bit of balance here. And one thing I believe that you're asked to comment on in your presentations on the social benefits of shared mobility. Now, I don't think anyone did, to be honest. So I want to dig into that a little bit. Particularly, I'd like to start with asking about the demographic of who uses your services and whether there are particular gaps, basically. And to be clear, some of your services are not going to be accessible to all. So I think I'd like to hear people being honest about that and just talk about why that is and whether that's something you can get over or not.
Happy to kick us off, and thank you for the question. I think it's absolutely vital to speak about this. I strongly believe that shared mobility is critical to a fairer transport system for all. And particularly, I think we're speaking to here today, expansion being a core part of that to enable people that aren't currently accessing the scheme to do so. So we've implemented a number of measures to broaden out access, but we certainly do see that with the e-scooter trial, where you're required to have a driving licence to access it, and it's concentrated in central London boroughs, that the demographic is largely young white males. On our e-bike service, where it's slightly broader access, the barriers to using the services are lower, i.e. don't require a driving licence to use it. It's much more parity across genders and age groups that we see for that mode. There's certainly a further way to go. I think we also need to recognise, while we've all spoken to the Mayor's transport strategy, the goals that are laid out, ambitious goals that we have for Vision Zero, we also have ambitious goals about public health, about green jobs, about air quality, and these are all benefits that micromobility has been evidenced to bring where it is enabled to take place in a city. And certainly, again, we can recognise that in London, outer London boroughs are generally worse affected by poor air pollution, poor air quality and congestion. Generally hits the deprived areas of London the worst, but they're also the places that we're reaching the least with our services at the moment. We have also introduced financial access opportunities as well, knowing that access is also kind of dependent on income. So we run things like an access scheme working in partnership with Job Centre Plus, providing up to 50% off trips. We work with third sector groups also across London to provide free access, training, all funded by TIER directly.
Okay, I do want to give other people a chance, and I have got other questions as well. So if everyone could try and tone down the pitching a little bit, because I ain't got any money, so just to give you, so just tone down. Can I ask
Happy
a follow up? Because so are you saying that the reason that your micromobility services are more likely to be young white males, which I think we'll accept, is because of a driving licence and because they're in London? You don't accept that there's any other reasons why they wouldn't be so used by other demographics?
I'm sure that it's a very complex, a great number of reasons that people choose to use different forms of transport. I think infrastructure is also a major contributing factor to why people choose the form of transport that they do. But I absolutely would say that a requirement to have a driving licence is a particularly large barrier for most people to access these forms of transport.
Okay. Anyone else like to come in on who uses their services?
I can jump in on this.
Yeah.
So we have parity among males and females in the service, but what we really try to do is deploy bikes in the boroughs that we operate across the entire borough. So we're looking at, not just the affluent areas, but also the deprived areas too, and that really helps to improve the uptake from all demographics.
Okay. Anyone else?
Just from the Centre Their Cycle Hire scheme. So
Sorry.
we have limited data because we don't collect too much data. Broadly, half of our customers are unregistered, so we don't actually know who they are. But from our registered membership, around 35% are female members. So I'd like to think that we are kind of more open to cycling for both sexes. So
Yeah, I think we're about 50%, just around. It's quite a big gap.
So just from a car sharing point of view, I mean, obviously we're very conscious that initially the perception is it is more expensive, but ultimately we have worked out on a number of occasions, I think there have been a number of studies to demonstrate that actually car sharing is actually much cheaper than owning a private car. You can save anything between £1,500 to £3,000 a year. So that, I think, is a point around trying to raise awareness, the fact that actually having access to a car club is more affordable, and that enables more people to get access to a compliant vehicle, particularly with the forthcoming potential extended ULEZ. I think there's a massive role that could be played to actually creating packages that enable people to make the shift during that time to car sharing or other modes of transport that can actually enable them to save money. In terms of kind of trying to broaden out our reach during the pandemic in particular, we gave 50% discounts to NHS workers to make sure that they could get access to the vehicles during some of the most challenging times to get around London, particularly during night time as well, and we continue to offer those types of discounts. And I think there's also a geographical point about trying to obviously extend the service so that we can go into outer London where there are less choices around public transport and getting around London. And obviously we've always been very, very keen to work with boroughs to make that happen, and we're in ongoing discussions to try and ensure that does happen. But again, that it means we need a concerted vision and strategy to piece everything together to enable those things to happen.
Understood. Alan, do you?
Yeah, and so to echo some of the other stuff, in terms of we don't collect demographic data on users, we do occasionally do surveys which have that as a field that people can supply to us. We are about to redo some of that research in the next couple of months, so we can perhaps share some of the information from that if that's of interest around particularly maybe the comparator between e-scooters and e-bikes might be quite interesting. Yes. I think in terms of what we see in London compared to elsewhere, I think certainly in terms of in talking in general terms, because I said we don't have the demographic data on users, but I think the longer services have been in cities, the broader the usage becomes. So I think whilst we do see probably early adopters of lots of new technologies, and this isn't just transport, this comes to lots of different new technology, being younger, being more predominantly male, being more predominantly affluent, over time, I think that demographic does broaden, and I think we've probably seen that across London, particularly on our e-bike service over that 4 years. In addition to that, we do things that try to reach out to make sure that people from a broader spectrum of society can use our services. So we have a programme called Lime Access, which provides 50% discount to anyone who has a concession travel pass. It's one of the things we do to try and encourage more people to use the service. We also do stuff like translate flyers and literature in certain areas into different languages, so that for people whose English isn't their first language can also understand how to use our service and get a kind of a good understanding of that. So we do try and push that.
Okay, thanks. I'll come in. I've got further follow-ups to that. But just to say, I'm a bit surprised and disappointed that no one, with the exception Zipcar is a slightly different situation, but no one's acknowledged that e-bikes and e-scooters are not accessible for all Londoners. I mean, maybe it's obvious, but I think that's something that certainly we need to consider. Some people will never use them. And I just don't know why anyone didn't mention it, to be honest. It's a bit odd. These are people who will never be able to, some people will never be able to use your services. So I want to ask a follow-up as well. Sorry, not follow-up, a further question, which is about the types of trips that are taken, your services. Alan, you mentioned types of trips early on, but actually then you just talked about length of trips. So you didn't talk about what sort of trips were taken, because I'll be honest, I think that they're more likely to be discretionary trips. They're not necessarily going to be, they're very unlikely to be trips where people are doing caring activities, there's all sorts of stuff. And I really want to know whether you have a sense of, because I want to look at the transport system overall and what positive benefits it can socially add. I'm genuine about this. But if we don't acknowledge that there are limits to it, then we're not going to make the right decisions. Do you have any data about what sort of journeys are taken?
If I may just also speak to the prior comment, I think it's really important to acknowledge that accessibility is varied and complex. Now, accessibility to mobility can mean if you have a hip ailment, it might actually be easier for you to use an e-bike than a pedal bike, for example. So there are those that are benefited by e-mobility and accessibility access. And I just, if I get, we absolutely do recognise that not everybody is able to be a direct user of our services. And that's why we are very serious about engaging those communities about how we design our services so that they are not negatively impacted by them either. Okay. So we formed a...
I'm going to come back and ask about negative impact,
Please.
If that's all right, so we'll get an opportunity. So in terms of the type of journeys.
Yes, so as Alan mentioned, we do regularly run surveys. I think I also spoke to the level of research that we've been able to do across the e-scooter trials in particular. So we do see peaks around commuting hours. So we do see a lot of utility trips taking place. Some of the major reasons that people provide to us in terms of why they're taking their trips is to their workplace, to see friends, loved ones, to go shopping, to visit their local high streets. So certainly these are forms of transport that are serving purpose for people in the city.
Okay, it'd be great to see data on that, because there are obviously limited. That, I want to see what that actually looks like. So anyone, I know I'm running out of time, and people are getting fidgety over this side. So if you could be short, that would be much appreciated, because I have got another question to add up. But yeah,
I can just echo what Georgia said around commuter peaks.
Yep.
We see about 70% of our trips take place either in the morning and the evening, particularly in the evening. And 60% of our users each day take a trip twice, so we're sort of seeing that the return trip.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone got any more data on it? Thanks.
No surprises there, but commuting is obviously our number one in the week. So short trips, mainline stations to central London, weekend, Royal Parks. Most popular trip on the scheme is round the Royal Park.
Thanks. And finally, I did want to come back to this question of the negative impacts, whether you acknowledge there are any negative impacts, because obviously in terms of accessibility, other forms of transport are much more accessible. thinking about buses is something I've talked about for a lot. Is there any negative impact on our wider integrated transport system that you can see, that you would acknowledge from the services you operate?
I think the biggest challenge comes with around the more Dockless side of the model, so more around e-bikes, comes around things like parking of those e-bikes. In areas where there aren't sufficient parking spaces, people want to ride an e-bike to where they're going. That is part of the accessibility of the service. It's one of the ways accessibility of the service is improved, because it means that we can provide services in parts of London where perhaps there isn't existing infrastructure. It's one of the ways in which we quite complement things like the Santander scheme. Obviously, Santander schemes require capital investment and docking stations. That's expensive. They don't typically get put into right across London in an equal distribution. Okay. It's one of the ways we can do that. In terms of, but we need to make sure that in areas where there aren't designated parking areas, that we get on top of user behaviour to make sure that bikes aren't blocking things like pavements, they're not blocking cycle lanes for other people who are cycling. It's something we're working a lot on at the moment, particularly with the new users we've seen this year. That is a negative impact potentially that we are aware of and want to try to overcome.
Okay, but your answer is more parking.
More parking and better education, better enforcement from us and things like that. We acknowledge that's something to be worked on.
Thanks.
I think just echoing Alan on both sides of the coin there's no silver bullet. I don't think anyone would claim that we're going to solve the system-wide transport for London just as a single operator. So there's a level of collaboration that needs to come forward to enable varied trips, varied users, a broader number of people to access transport. So we're not claiming to be the silver bullet, but actually complementary to that broader transport system. And equally on resolving negative impacts, there is no silver bullet. It's absolutely not exclusively about parking, but of course our responsibility as operators also to educate, to deliver high quality and exceptional on-street operations as well. So certainly that is embedded in our ethos.
Thanks. I'll end there and thank you for your engagement. Thank you.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left on our session. I propose to offer that to the Conservative group to finish off. I've been timing everyone's contributions. Sean Bailey, I think you were first on my list, if that's you want to start. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to talk to you about expansion. As someone who lives and operates in the outer London boroughs, we feel like this micro transport conversation excludes us. Do you believe, and I want to start with Kate in particular, and we'll go wider, do you believe that you have the right business model to expand in a meaningful way into out of London?
That's quite a broad question, but to answer it simply, yes, we believe that we can expand into outer London, and we certainly would like to. And we're in conversation with a number of boroughs in order to be able to achieve that, particularly with our flex service. We'd also like to see more round-trip bays in some of the outer London boroughs. I think in the information pack that we sent over to you with a couple of maps, you can see that the number of bays are actually quite limited in outer London at the moment. And I think in order to be able to increase that, again, coming back to the points about it comes down to, I think, to borough time, because what we're finding is that the conversations we're having with boroughs, they're all wanting to draft their local transport strategies, but these take time to come through before they then make the decisions regarding whether they want to expand car clubs into their boroughs. And then it comes down to borough time to go through the whole contracts process to give us the opportunity to expand the services. And again, that process always takes time, which is why I think some of the solutions could be around having a sense of, like, for example, I think Mayor Glanville recently suggested that with each borough they have like a healthy streets index, and maybe car sharing could be incorporated as part of the healthy streets index. Maybe that could be also applied to other forms of transport as well. So each borough then has a clear target that says this is what we want to achieve. London has a clear target, this is what we want to achieve across all mobility forms, and then we can then make sure that the right type of policies and systems and best practice modes can actually be implemented to enable that growth to happen. So to answer your question, yes, we do believe we've got it, and yes, we'd like to work with boroughs to do that. And we have obviously good working relationship with a lot of the boroughs, love working with them, but I think a lot of it does tend to come down to borough resources from our perception. Obviously, love to hear it from the borough perspective as well.
Okay, just before we go wide and talk about bike share schemes, etc., from a user point of view, do you think your service can provide enough utility to overcome the difference in car usage in and out of London? Because it's interesting reading your pack, people using a car, your members using a car 1 to 5 times a year, whereas in outer London, cars are 1 to 5 times a day. You know, do you think your service has anything to offer from a user point of view where they would actually then reject their car entirely or at all?
I mean, obviously, I think there's going to be lots of things that are going to enable people to make the shift from private car ownership to car sharing. And I think the reason why car sharing and other forms of mobility have been so successful in central London is because there's choice. There's a lot of choice of public transport. There's a lot of choice of other modes of transport. And I think that's the key challenge in outer London to overcome, is making sure that people have that choice. And I think car sharing together with micromobility, alongside bike sharing, alongside more public transport, that package of measures will enable people to make the switch. We can't do this alone, and I think this is where we need to look at our transport system in a more integrated way, in a smarter way, and actually think about how we can piece some of these elements together to make sure that outer London is better served.
Okay. From a bike hire point of view?
I mean, I think it's certainly, yes. I mean, I think the model can definitely serve outer London boroughs. I think we haven't had great success in the last 3 years finding outer London boroughs that wanted to approach that and want to try and work with us on that. But I mean, we do also are completely aware that also, you know, one of the good things about the type of model that we offer is it's pretty adaptable from place to place. So we operate slightly differently in the UK to we do in France, to we do within a city and somewhere else in the world, which means that we have a certain amount of adaptability we can use. And I think for outer London boroughs in particular, it might be that we need to look at it and say, well, actually, the way we operate the service is slightly different, or we look at a slightly different model with the local authority. So in inner London, we end up paying local authorities for contracts if we win tenders, because they think that this is going to be a very valuable service. In outer London boroughs, the profit margins are probably slightly less, wider areas, potentially less cycling. So therefore, we might want to look at how we do that, because there are certain fixed costs with our business that mean that we want to try and make sure that this is something that if we were to launch it would last for 5 years, not 5 weeks. And so working with different local authorities around London to understand that context and to make sure that this is viable in the long run, I think is something we can definitely do, and I think it does have a future, certainly.
Okay.
Yeah, I can just echo that as opening in Kingston and Seton at the end of this month. We're looking really at replacing car trips from home to the train station, whereas in central London it can really be a trip, you know, from A to B rather than integrating the tube as well. So it's around how we position those bikes in a way that enable people to get to the stations so that they can then jump on the tube and head into central London or wherever they need to go.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, really echoing my peers here that the short answer is yes. We have the business model and the will to expand these services into outer London. It's absolutely possible. We bring experience from many other capital cities, but also more rural cities, operations in over 540 to be able to bring that to London. What's going to be critical is long-term planning, close network planning partnership with the local authority, making sure that we are building and designing a service that will fill the gaps that are inevitably there.
I think there's probably not a month goes by where I don't get a mayor's question about expanding to a borough somewhere. And we'd love to. You know, from our perspective, we should. We would love to. I think particularly for us, you know, if it's a co-join, new borough that's joining onto the existing scheme to make it operationally efficient, I think we'd very much like to, and we think it's a propensity to cycle as you start to edge out. So from our perspective, there's also the financial constraints we're under. But yes, we think we could expand the scheme quite easily.
You all say you have the business model to do it, but why hasn't it happened then? Because if you look at all of your services, they are focused certainly on central London. My experience of London, I've been all over this town for reasons that are obvious to some, you don't appear anywhere. For car hire in particular, I think there's a real challenge around behaviour change, because people in out of London keep cars for a different reason to people in inner London. Like Caroline talked about A to B travel. I think an inner London car is more A to B. In out of London, it's how do you get across your borough. So I think the question is, why hasn't, if you do have the models, and you all said you do, why hasn't that happened up till now? Is it local authority enthusiasm? Is it lack of investment? What is it?
I think our schemes are all growing. So we've had 200 bikes and now we're 1,300 and we're going to take on more bikes. So as the supply gets bigger and we can resource it, then we're definitely looking to open it. It's just sort of naturally you start in one borough and you want to open in the borough next door from a user perspective, and slowly that patchwork is going to grow and build out, but it requires, you know, to start in the middle.
Fair enough, I accept that.
We're certainly trying. I think we're investing a huge amount of resource into demonstration days, speaking with councillors, all the various stakeholders, that complex environment that we've spoken to support expansion. It's certainly possible as well. There are routes to joining. So if boroughs are listening to this and aren't aware, it's still possible to join the e-scooter trial. It's likely to continue for quite some time. So we would like to see that grow. We can't force the hand, but certainly welcome participation. On the e-bike side, in fact, on all sides for TIER, we only run our operations in partnership with local authorities. It's vital to be joint value creators in delivering these services. They don't work where you don't have that partnership and shared aim. So we do actually only launch where we have that collaboration, and that does mean a staggered and slow rollout at the moment. I think also we should acknowledge the regulatory environment and the changing regulatory environment that might bring some uncertainty. Of course, I think it's a little bit clearer where we are with the e-scooter trials, even though we've still got at least another kind of 2 years of the trial environment before we see the transport bill come through. It's indicated that the transport bill will look at micromobility as a whole, so maybe there's some concerns there around a changing regulatory environment also for pedal bikes and e-bikes, so making it a little bit more challenging, I think, for the public sector to make long-term decisions versus short-term kind of agreements and approvals. We absolutely do need to see long-term planning to make these options viable in the city.
We would definitely welcome your support to enable us to expand. We've particularly been keen to expand our flex service to a handful of boroughs, and we've been talking to those boroughs for quite some time to enable that to happen. But whether it's a resource question, I think that's something you need to ask those boroughs. Could be very, very keen to do that.
Yes. Okay, thank you. I think my last question really is directed at car clubs again. What more can you do to educate people to be interested? I'm only interested in car clubs because there used to be one right outside my doorstep. I came out, the car was there, I thought, great. What else can be done? What could the mayor be doing? What the government could be doing to allow people to be much more aware of not only car services but bike services as well? Is that work being done? Are you doing it on your side?
I mean, obviously, we invest a lot in marketing and information awareness ourselves as an organisation, but also equally, as I think I've suggested before, we do need to have a clear vision for what it is that we want to achieve across London. You look at other cities, I think I mentioned this earlier, in terms of the kind of growth that they've managed to achieve over the past few years. London used to be a world leader in terms of its car club, but that has now obviously dipped. We're still sustaining very good growth as an organisation. We have 20% growth each year. However, we do need London to get behind car clubs and also other forms of mobility and have a clear vision for what it is that we want to achieve. And the same goes with all the boroughs as well. We can do this, but we need to work together on it. And I think a much more detailed vision and strategy needs to be applied to car clubs and other forms of mobility in order to be able to achieve what it is that you're saying. I think people are aware of the choices, but I think, it's about just making sure that they're more visible. So visibility can only occur by having more car clubs and more car club bays, and I suspect the same goes with bikes and their other forms of mobility. Mobility hubs, by having a greater presence with mobility hubs where people can actually see where these things are. Visibility is absolutely key in enabling people to ensure that they can have the choices that they want to make.
Okay, Chair, thank you.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Bailey there. We're pretty much out of time for this session of the meeting, and we need to be able to put some questions to the policymakers. But I noted down that Transport for London, Santander Cycles, are the only operator on the list who have not given us their view on which policy changes might be needed. Now, that might be for understandable reasons. But I wanted to ask you a quick question, therefore. one of the things that always comes up, and everybody thinks, and you probably agree, is that the bikes ought to be integrated with Oyster and contactless. Can you explain why that has never happened, and if there's a policy change we could ask for that might help?
We did look at this in 2015. There was a view from City Hall that we should integrate. We looked at it. We set out how much it would cost and the technical difficulties, and it was broadly around, at that time, £83 million project to implement, and we would have ended up with more Oyster readers on our scheme than we would across the whole transport network. Every docking point would need an Oyster reader, but technically it was deemed to be way too difficult at that point. I think it is still too difficult. With the introduction of contactless payment now, I think it gives more people easier access than having to become a member. But yeah, we did look at it, but technically it wasn't deemed good value for money.
Okay, because your new pricing structure mirrors the bus fare, as you mentioned earlier on. So it seems like maybe we could ask TfL about that in the next session, because it seems like it ought to be thought about again, maybe. Okay, thank you very much. That now brings to a close this session. I want to thank you all for coming. I realise there are probably questions on people's notes in front of them as members that probably still want to be asked. Is it all right if we write as a committee to each of you with a few notes and queries, as it were? I know some of you have promised us additional data, so we've noted that, and we'll write to you and confirm that we'd like you to send us that as well. So thank you very much. We'll now adjourn the meeting for 5 or 6 minutes until 11:30, and we'll be back with our second panel of guests. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back to the London Assembly Transport Committee. We're here looking at shared mobility in this meeting. We've spent the first half of the meeting talking with various operators, including Santander Cycles, and now we have some of the leaders of this within Transport for London on strategy, and some experts from the industry and academia to discuss things with us. We would have liked to also have had, given some of the discussions we've just had, someone to represent the boroughs here today. We did try, and we thought we were expecting someone from London councils, and we were hopeful that the noises coming from various boroughs might result in an extra guest. But at the last minute, that did not happen. So what I think we'll do is we'll write to London councils and the boroughs that we were in contact with to ask them the same questions that we were going to ask them today, and ask for a written response to inform our investigation. But then I welcome the guests that are here today, and I'm really, really pleased to have all of you here today. We'll carry on the meeting up until about 5 to 11, so that gives us nearly an hour and a half to talk. We have Alina Tuerk, who is the Strategy and Planning Manager for City Planning for Transport for London. We have Thomas Ableman, who is the Director of Strategy and Innovation at Transport for London. We have Richard Dilks, who is the Chief Executive of CoMoUK. And I think when you give your first answer, if you can explain a little bit more about your role. And Dr. Thomas Cohen, who is a Senior Lecturer in Transport at the University of Westminster and has done much work on this area, I believe, as well. So thank you all for coming, and I'll lead off with my first question to you all. And I think, first of all, to Transport for London, in fact, how are the aims set out in the Mayor's transport strategy actually being translated into action on shared mobility in London?
One? Right, marvellous. Excellent. I'll learn to do that. Apologies, first time. So there's a number of different facets to the answer to that. The first is that the Mayor's Transport Strategy gives us a clearly defined framework for evaluating all forms of new mobility innovation as they occur. So there's a number of things that we consider, such as the likelihood to reduce the number of car trips and increase the mode share of cycling and active travel, whether new mobility modes take up space on the roads or the amount of space they take up, sustainability, etc. So we have a watching brief on all forms of new mobility, and this is an area that's seen a lot of innovation in recent years. Then there's a number of specifics, and so the e-scooter trial is probably the most significant thing that we are doing at the moment, where e-scooters on a global basis have increased dramatically in the last 5 years. The government made provision for authorities at either level of government to lead trials of e-scooters, and it felt that from a London perspective this was an area we needed to understand more. We needed to understand whether e-scooters could be safe. That was the most important thing, because they were probably going to happen no matter what we did, and if so, how. And we needed to try to understand whether they could form a part of the mobility landscape to achieve the Mayor's transport strategy. So for the last just over a year, we've been operating a trial of rental e-scooters in partnership with 10 London boroughs, working with 3 operators, who I think you heard from earlier. But there's a number of other areas as well, some of which are more business as usual, such as constantly working on evaluating, and I think car clubs is something you want to talk about later, but evaluating the potential for car clubs to form part of the mobility landscape, and making sure that that's done in a way in which it achieves the outcomes of the Mayor's transport strategy, reducing car trips, and giving people choices to move away from car, as opposed to giving people choices to move into car use.
I mean, that is my current question, actually, so carry on if you want. I'm interested in, the Mayor's got a target now to reduce traffic volumes by 27%, about a third, in the next decade. Do you have an idea from the work you've been doing on forecasting, on the potential expansion of the market, the impact of the e-scooter trial? Do you now have an idea of what contribution shared transport provision can make towards that target?
Quite deliberately, we don't seek to break out we have an overall target of 80%. We track on a annual quarterly basis, the progress we're making towards 80% mode share of public transport and active travel. But we don't seek to set specific modal targets. And there's a number of reasons for that. Part of the reason is that the mobility landscape is constantly evolving, and actually we can lock ourselves in to making decisions that aren't optimal overall, and partly because these are modes in which we're constantly learning. Alina, is there anything you'd like to add?
Can I come back to you on that, though, just to say that before we had a mode share target, but now we have a traffic miles target, and I think it might be easier to model and measure the amount of options, other options there might be, the cost pressures that change people from 1 mile driven to a mile travelled a different way, or not driven at all, not travelled at all. Do you see what I mean? There is a slightly different forecasting job to do if you've got that new target.
I'll let Alina come in and then I'll come back.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. That's more of a question for Alina, I think.
Fran, thanks. I'll pick up the 27% first and then maybe rewind a little bit to your first question, if that's all right. So on the 27%, I think it's important to distinguish that there's 27% reduction in car kilometres that has been identified by Element Energy as being needed to meet the accelerated net zero carbon target. That is different from a target that is set out in the MTS. So as part of the work that we're doing at the moment to understand how can TfL and how can transport contribute to meeting net zero and to reducing car kilometres, what we're doing is testing a number of different packages of different transport interventions to see, what is the magnitude of change that different types of interventions can get us. That work is very much in the early stages, so I haven't got any numbers to say, okay, car clubs or shared mobility gives you X, but we're looking at packages as a whole. And then just coming back to the first part of your question, which I think was around how to make what's set out in the MTS more tangible. I think you will be really familiar with the various outcomes in the MTS, but especially from a car club perspective, I think the 2 central drivers here are our 80% sustainable mode share target, and then also the target of reducing car trips by 3 million, and also the number of vehicles owned by 250,000, which isn't insubstantial. And the MTS is really clear in its proposal 19, which sets out the role that car clubs have to play in achieving that overall vision. And that makes it really clear that the focus here is on their potential in especially inner and outer London, and the ability to contribute to that reduction when combined with other traffic reduction and parking reduction measures, rather than as interventions in themselves. So in order to ensure that we're actually seeing a reduction in car trips rather than an additional generation in car trips, where someone might now replace a bus trip with a car trip, for example, which is obviously something I think everyone, including all the operators, would want to avoid. And in order to make that more tangible, what we've been doing over the past 12 months or so is a lot of work in reviewing the policies that are in place, looking at existing research that is there to understand what are the gaps in our understanding to help us take this work further forward, but also start much more proactive engagement with the various stakeholders in this space. And what that has led to is something that Kate briefly referred to earlier, is that we have a couple of months ago published or shared at a round table 6 commitments around car clubs, and the intention of those is to make this proposal 19 in the MTS much more tangible, to say what does that mean for TfL and what are we proposing to do over the next year or so in order to help advance this area. I can give you a quick summary of those commitments now, if that's helpful. Yep. So the overall aim here really is to not think about car club policy in isolation, but think about how can car clubs be complementary to other policy measures that we're implementing and the goals we're pursuing, because that way they're likely to be much more successful. So the first commitment is around a point that's been mentioned a few times, which is around helping facilitate an even playing field, including also data sharing among boroughs. So we've heard about the patchwork quite a lot, and a centralised way of accessing the data is certainly something that from a policy and planning perspective would make things much more helpful, but I'm sure for operators it's also much more practical. We initially there looked at using the data sharing platform that's been set up for the e-scooter trial and to build onto that, but quickly in discussion with operators found that that just wasn't the most suitable way of doing it. It was very costly for operators to provide the data in which the platform brought it in, just because slightly different data is collected from an e-scooter than it is from a car club vehicle. So what we're doing now is that we're supporting London councils who are leading on this to work together with the GLA to develop a new system that will provide a dashboard to enable us to use that data in a much more accessible and user-friendly way. The second commitment is around ensuring that car clubs are much more prominent in public policies and messaging around alternatives to private car use. So the focus here is very much on ULEZ at the moment and a review of our website. The third commitment is around making more of car clubs and other third-party offers when we're looking at scrappage schemes. So as part of the potential further expansion of the ULEZ that's currently being worked on, active discussions are in place with operators to look at whether third-party offers could be included. Building on that as a form of how could that be further expanded into mobility credits if we're rolling out integrated road user charging, bringing all our schemes together. Number 5 is more effective utilization of EV charging infrastructure. And then finally, number 6 is to ensure that we hold quarterly meetings to keep track of the progress that we're making in that space. Thank you for letting me go through all of those.
No, it's really helpful. Sorry to hurry you along. I know we have follow-up questions on several aspects of that, but to get that overview was really, really helpful. If I could move to our other guests now. First of all, to Richard Dilks from CoMoUK. We heard the operators earlier being very, very confident that the provision of their services took away car journeys. And I think for car clubs in particular, there is some scepticism about that. Do you have the data and the evidence to back up that car club provision doesn't, for example, take people away from buses and put them in cars? And therefore, can you help Transport for London with its forecasting and modelling to say how many car trips shared mobility can take away?
Thank you, Chair. To your earlier question, just to define what CoMo is briefly, we are a charity for the social, economic, environmental benefits of shared transport. So we work closely with authorities. We're a national organisation, including London, but not limited to it, and also with operators whom we have accredited memberships with in the e-bike sharing space and collective memberships in the e-scooter space, and in the car club space also. And our focus goes beyond into other forms of shared transport, DRT, and etc.
Could you put the microphone a bit closer to you?
Oh, sorry.
Your face, thank you. Sorry.
Hear me properly. So to go to the question, we do have that modelling already. We have done this in depth for Car Club about 6 months ago now, which we've shared, of course, with TfL, and I hope is being used in detail in the background by them to look at the potential. I have to say the doubt about the ability of shared transport, particularly car clubs, but not just the shared micromobility options to take down car use, continues to recede from our point of view. It's still there. We still get that question, and quite rightly, but we get it less often than we used to. I think the evidence is extremely strong on this. We've been conducting our research annually in very much the same way, but of course with different people. It's with users that research I'm drawing on here for the last decade now, and we find this a very, very consistent theme. The number, Kate from Zipcar mentioned it earlier, the current number in London is 24 private cars per car club car. That's gently risen over the years, but it's very much in the same sort of ballpark. I do think the evidence is very much there. This is what people are reporting to us year in, year out, in their thousands, specifically in London. So it's an important weapon, car club, but it is only one weapon, just as shared micromobility is a very important weapon, it's also only one weapon. So I think what London needs to do much better at is working with these weapons individually, but also collectively, and seeing them in as part of a suite of options, very much alongside public transport and very much alongside walking and cycling. And the reason I say that is not just the decarbonisation crisis the city faces, but also that that is what users are already doing. And again, we have 5+ years of research on the micromobility side and 10 years now on the car club side of people reporting to us that is exactly what they're doing, both in terms of contrasting their current behaviour with their previous behaviour, but also in terms of questions where we ask them how do they behave, and we stack that against the standard London data or the standard national data, and we find that they are using active and public transport much more than the norm.
Okay, thank you very much. So Tom, as a academic professional looking at all of this, do these claims all stack up? Is there strong evidence that these things can contribute towards these overall goals of the Mayor's transport strategy in terms of how they work?
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps I can just start by making a bid for some terminological rigour. I think we use the word shared rather lazily, and it creates the expectation that anything that is shared is necessarily a good thing. And it's not as simple as that. If I own a drill and I lend it to my neighbour and I don't charge them, I have shared my drill. If I have a car and I charge you to drive you to the airport, I'm a minicab driver. And I think this is the kind of distinction that's helpful, because not all of these operators are equally philanthropic, and therefore we couldn't necessarily expect them all to have an equally beneficial impact on the achievement of the goals that we've been talking about this morning. That said, yes, I think there's no question that the sorts of measures that we're talking about here have a part to play in moving us towards a lower carbon transport system. And the quantity of change that's possible, I think, is obviously the subject of ongoing debate and research. And I would love to be able to say, oh, well, it's straightforward. The answer is X%. And we don't know. London has some particular characteristics that mean it won't be the same as Paris or Munich. And we've heard a lot already today about the governance situation in London, which militates against certain things happening. Nevertheless, I have very high hopes for the potential for these sorts of transport to make a very significant contribution. But I would also say there is a risk that we will assume that it's a good idea for everybody to be sharing something when there may be a better case for them to own whatever that might be. At the moment, we're testing e-scooters in a very peculiar way through a trial scheme based on rental, and that's meant to help us to understand whether e-scooters are a good thing in general. Meanwhile, I don't need to tell you that there's a very large number of e-scooters being used, strictly speaking illegally, around the country, and they might end up being a larger part of the solution than the schemes that we're obviously very interested in here.
Thank you very much, Tom. So I know you're part of a wider academic community looking at all of this, and it is, early doors on a lot of it. Do you have any sense of a hierarchy of help that is emerging from all of this? Like you say, I think when we were discussing this committee, we excluded from scope looking at, for example, ride-hailing schemes or lift-sharing schemes, because we had to draw the line somewhere. It's definitely a spectrum. In terms of what's most helpful to reducing car use in particular, what do you think the most helpful ones are in descending order? What's emerging as the hierarchy?
Well, to clarify, is this to select from the group of measures that we've been talking about today, so the various things that we're calling shared?
Yes, but if you think something comes in between that you want to mention.
Sure. I would say in the London context, and this isn't something I can offer evidence to support, but it's my hunch, that micromobility, another term we should perhaps be careful to define, has a greater amount to offer to us than car sharing. Which is not to say that car sharing doesn't have a great deal to offer. It's just that I think you've asked for a hierarchy, and I would put micromobility above cars. I would put, and I hesitate to say this, bicycles above scooters because of their range. But this is where I feel like I have to admit my Active Travel Academy hat at the University of Westminster and say, well, walking trumps all of these. And I'm afraid there's no buck to be made from walking, which is why we don't have walking representatives at today's session.
And public transport, does that also sit above all of these?
So to return to your question, it was in order to reduce car use. Yeah, it has a massive role to play. Quite where it fits in respect of walking and cycling, I think, again, is a subject that you could debate back and forth. The average car driver does not harbour a strong desire to take public transport. It's sad to say, but I think it has to be acknowledged. Micromobility, on the other hand, does have an appeal to someone who is used to the autonomy of having their own vehicle which they can use whenever they wish to go from A to B without any kind of detour. And that is probably the reason why public transport is always going to struggle to compete with the car. And I suspect that economic incentives are going to be more effective in getting people out of their cars where it's a long trip and public transport is the obvious alternative.
Okay, that's really interesting, but we'll come back to all of these questions later. It's interesting that you think that privately owned e-scooters might compete with cars, and I'm sure that's an emerging area of study. We'll get back to that later on. So handing over questioning now to Assembly Member Garrett.
Morning. Hello. My questions are about the expansion, which was an area, I think I saw some of you in the audience, it was an area that was pressed by a number of my colleagues about all of these schemes. There's a sort of Matthew effect whereby the people in inner London who already have good public transport get lots of these micro-mobility schemes, and those of us, I represent 2 outer London boroughs, Croydon and Sutton, none of them really exist in Croydon or Sutton. I have maps here of where Lime operates and where Zipcar are, and there's a sort of great big donut of boroughs where they either don't exist or don't exist in any meaningful way. And I think we heard, I would interpret as some bullish statements earlier from the scheme operators about how they have plans to expand. Lime actually used to exist in Sutton and Croydon, and I think Merton and now don't. I'm interested in understanding, what you just said, Tom, I found a breath of fresh air and very, very interesting. So I'm interested in, is it realistic that these shared schemes, so my question to TfL is, what plans do you have? And I think when I come to Tom, I'm particularly interested in the sort of, theoretically, is it realistic to think that these shared schemes could operate viably in areas of lower population density, a less kind of dense journey network, where perhaps private e-bikes, which I own and use all the time, perhaps have more viability? So if I start with TfL, what plans do you have to see those schemes expand into outer London boroughs, not just Croydon, Sutton, the whole area where they currently don't exist?
Yeah, sure. No, and I think one of the things that really excites me about these modes is the potential they have for outer London. If you look at the Mayor's transport strategy and our 80% target by 2041, it's clear that there's a lot to be done in outer London to achieve that target. Therefore, modes that can be deployed into outer London, and it's not realistic to assume that we're going to have an extremely dense tube network in outer London by 2041. So there are other things that have to be done, and these are modes which they don't require large-scale capital investment, they don't require large-scale land use changes, and as Tom said earlier, actually they have that sense of autonomy, which for outer London locations where people have more dispersed journey patterns and more trip chaining could be highly suitable. Now, one of the challenges at the moment is that the 3 micromobility modes are all operated independently and in total isolation from each other. So you've got a cycle hire scheme, which is operated in-house by TfL using docked infrastructure. You have an e-scooter scheme, which is operated through a TfL series of licenses on a relatively controlled basis by 3 third-party operators. You have an e-bike set of schemes, which are operated on an unregulated basis, but conventionally through agreement with individual local boroughs. And that isn't a particularly efficient way of operating 3 models which actually have a lot of commonality. They all largely require warehousing, maintenance, redistribution of fleet, but at the moment those things are all dispersed and all done independently. So one of the questions that we're asking is there a way of doing these in a more integrated way? If we do that in a more integrated way, then it clearly has the potential to improve the experience of the consumer, because we heard a lot this morning about how consumers don't understand borough boundaries, therefore the scheme is confusing, and the fact that all of these have different pricing structures, tariff structures, different access modes, etc. But it also might change the economics of the scheme, or the scheme or schemes as well. Now, we're helped in that regard by the fact that there's a transport bill just starting its passage through Parliament at the moment. It looks likely that that bill will enable a city authority such as TfL to regulate the e-bike market and the e-scooter market as we have done the e-bike market and the e-scooter market as we have done through the e-scooter trial, but so far only on a strictly time-limited basis. And so if we do come out of this legislation...
Apologies to interrupt. When you say regulate the e-scooter and e-bike market, you're talking about the shared,
correct,
commas, the rental scheme, not the personal ownership scheme.
Correct, absolutely. The rental market, so the types of business model that we've been talking about today. So if we come out of that legislative process with all three of these mobility modes regulated through a city authority, with the ability therefore to create a single consistent scheme, then it seems likely that that will A, drive down the cost, and B, increase the revenue. Now, we're still at our early stages of thinking about the implications of that and what we would like to do to fulfil that. One of the things we don't want to do is lose the dynamism of the private sector, where we've seen huge amounts of innovation in this space over the last few years. So it's really important that we get whatever the outcomes of that right, and we're talking a lot to the market. We've undertaken 2 market sounding questionnaires this year so far and are continuing that active dialogue. But it feels like we could be at a moment where it's possible to achieve things that simply weren't possible previously, and all our focus, a huge amount of our focus, is on how we can expand these models to Outer London to make use of that.
Sorry, when you talk about interoperability, do you mean, so you would have one app, so rather than now you have, say, the Lime app or the Tier app, you would have one app that would allow access to all of those different commercial providers? Is that what you just described?
Potentially. We don't know exactly what the outcome will be because we're at a relatively early stage of thinking. But what we do want to achieve is it becoming far easier and more accessible for consumers, far more comprehensible to consumers, to feel a more integrated experience with the public transport network, because actually these modes aren't used in isolation, and the less they are used in isolation, the better they'll be able to contribute to our MTS targets. So whether that is one app, whether it's integration between apps, whether it's integration between operators having their own apps and TfL having data sharing, I don't know what that will look like in the end, but we know what we're trying to achieve.
That sounds like a lot of possibilities in terms of people living in those boroughs wondering if or when they'll see any of these schemes. What would you say?
So we are doing that thinking at the moment in parallel with that legislation going through Parliament. So it is likely that'll be roughly a year's process. There's then going to be some time for the DfT to draft the details of any regulations that emerge. So our goal is to do our thinking, to determine what our view is, and I'll very happily come back to this committee and share our thinking once we're at that stage, in parallel, so that as the legislative process reaches its conclusion and we know what it looks like in detail, we're also ready with our thinking as to how we want to use those regulatory powers that emerge.
In terms of a specific deadline, the Mayor currently has just finished consulting on, is currently deciding on whether to expand the ULEZ zone into all of those boroughs, the ones I've just mentioned and others. So it doesn't sound like this is something that might happen in time for that. So in terms of what transport alternatives people might have that the Mayor is encouraging them with the stick of ULEZ to switch to, sounds like we're going to be a carrot-free zone for the foreseeable.
Yeah, I'm not expecting any significant expansion of any of the existing micromobility modes at some point in 2023. Beyond that, that organically may happen through operators' own decision making.
Okay.
It's for beyond that.
Okay, thank you. So actually, sorry, I realised that we have 2 Toms. I do apologise. So, Dr. Cohen, in terms of in terms of the sort of viability of these sort of rental schemes, I think you touched on it earlier. Is the sort of academic research suggesting that in these less dense areas it is always going to be difficult, and that a more fruitful avenue might be private ownership and sort of personal use, or do you think, in terms of them expanding into bits of London where they currently don't exist?
Well, I would hesitate to overstate my expertise on this, but it's perhaps a simple matter of economics. There is a density in central London, there is a market, and as has been said was by certain of our earlier witnesses, it's no surprise therefore that that's where most of the activity is. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't be possible to turn a buck in outer London, and I imagine it would be. I would be amazed if there aren't examples of successful rental schemes, and perhaps Richard can tell us about them, in less dense areas. It hasn't happened in London yet, and what we were hearing earlier was that that's largely to do with, it seems, reluctance on the part of the boroughs as opposed to a lack of enthusiasm on the part of the operators. Perhaps we should take that with a pinch of salt. They are profit-seeking organisations for the most part, and you can therefore understand why they're going where the money is for now. But yes, I would be surprised if it weren't possible to make something like that work.
Thank you. I don't know whether, excuse me, thank you, Tom. I don't know whether you had anything to add on that, Richard, but specifically this question of the expansion of these kinds of schemes into Outer London.
Yes, thank you. The Outer London question's a very old one in this regard. Shared transport is in Outer London, but to variable extents it varies between the modes. So there's more shared car than there is shared bike, e-bike. The e-scooter trial, as I think Alan pointed out earlier, is broadly not covered Outer London. Those boroughs didn't step forward to that. So it's vital that this position changes if London is going to get there on the Mayor's mode share target, on zero carbon city targets. Thomas made this point earlier. It is the front line, if you like. To answer your question, Neil, in a sort of quick way, your original question, no, in the current policy environment. We are not going to see a big change or expansion here in the current setup. Multiple reasons for that: lack of TfL clarity and direction, enthusiasm, lack of coherence among boroughs, boroughs still rent-seeking around parking revenue, a point that was made in the earlier panel. But you know, we have to understand the context in which boroughs are operating. They lack this leadership and clear signal that shared transport's part of this sustainable future, and they lack any sort of particular financial incentives to go after this. Or that's certainly the perception. The economics are challenging, as Tom rightly pointed out, so that it is already a place where there are more headwinds to operating successfully, just on the raw basis of it. But there's variability potential in all of these things. These things can be shifted. So what an individual borough does or doesn't do with its parking policy, with its permitting policy, with how much it wants per permit for shared transport assets, with what sort of coverage it wants to see, with how it goes about promoting these options. What also TfL does with the ultra-low emission zone expansion, if it happens to all of London. It dropped the ball hugely on this with the expansion to north-south circular roads. But what it could do, ahead of all the legislative stuff, is promote shared transport very much alongside walking, cycling and public transport. Now, all of these actions then do filter through. So this is how we see in central and inner London, and those two are different for sure. You know, we see, for example, numbers of members served per car club car has continued to increase, and increase very strongly. And the growth in car club membership in London, which has been very strong in the last few years in particular, has not come with a big increase in the fleet. It's come with a modest increase in the fleet, varying a bit, but really it's come through more people using the things that were already there. So how do we reach those people in outer London? How do we make sure they have got options? How do we build? These are all the right questions, and it's going to be a step-by-step process if it's going to happen at all. But it does need active policy change. It needs much greater coherence. It needs different things to be done at the policymaker stage to give the market the impulses, the incentives to respond.
Just to push back on that, though, so you've said there needs to be clarity of direction, that this is the way that it's going. Surely that was the question I was asking, is that the way it's going or that should be going? Give my personal example. So my journey here this morning started, I could have had a 20-minute walk to my station. It was about a 5.5-minute e-bike ride. If I have to walk more than a few minutes to find an e-bike docking station, it starts to become that I might as well not bother. I might as well just walk or get the bus, which is about 10 minutes. So then you need a very dense network of those e-bikes. And so you come back to the question that we were asking earlier, is it actually viable, or is it better just to think about personal ownership of e-bikes, personal ownership of e-scooters as a more viable, realistic option if you want to do something that would actually make the car less obvious? So have you not assumed the question that we're not sure about?
So density is always your friend when you're a shared transport operation, just as it is a public transport operation. So outer London is of course not uniform. So the denser bits where you have dense aggregations of origin, destination in the jargon, places people want to go from and to, are always going to perform better. But even they are not being helped at the moment, is the point I'm trying to make. And we could, I think, then, once we've hypothetically sorted them out, look at the next, if you like, layer of density in outer London and think, well, what could we do to help with that? won't work everywhere in outer London. Absolutely, I'm not making that sort of blanket promise. Another point I'd make is there is not an either-or tension between private ownership of these things and shared use. So we find that shared bike schemes are very good at introducing people back to cycling. Very significant percentages, often around 50% of people using a scheme first time in a year are coming back to cycling after a while out of the saddle. I think that's very, very interesting. We're a nation of adults who know how to cycle. 70% of British adults say they know how to cycle, but we're not. So it's something that actually makes them think, oh, I'll give that a go. Now, then quite a significant percentage then go on to buy a bike, 12% in our last year's research. I think that's fantastic. Quite the opposite of any problem with that. I'm very happy with that. The more people cycling, the better. There cannot be enough. We're so far behind, even in London. So that's a very good funnel effect. But then what you find is some people using their own bikes as well as the shared schemes because they don't want to leave their bike at the station all day or whatever the case may be. This is all great. This is all people on bikes, so there really is no downside here. So it's much more mix and match and providing people with a range of options that are going to work for them and for a range of journeys. Particularly in outer London, of course, the point was made earlier, not just about radial getting into town stuff, it's about getting around outer London to the next door borough. This is where the borough coordination bit becomes absolutely vital. At the moment, it's completely lacking, and so we have 33 plus 1 different ways of trying to do it. It just doesn't work.
Thanks. So unless anyone had anything else they wanted to add on expansion into new areas, I think I've finished. I'm seeing lots of shaking of heads. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very, very much, Assemblyman Garrett. Right, so on this general background questions, I've got some follow-ups from Joanne McCartney coming.
Yeah, perhaps I can start with Alina, if I can. We did hear earlier that different boroughs have different, I suppose, objectives or inclination to support shared mobility. And I'm just wondering, has TfL actually tried to get boroughs together to get common standards, to get common objectives? And is this a fault of TfL, or is it just London councils don't have the same vision?
Thank you. So I think two aspects to that. So on the one hand, yes, different boroughs understandably will have different aspirations around shared mobility, just dependent on, their location, the public transport availability in those areas, what's the car ownership like. So comparing a Camden with a Croydon, for example, obviously the travel needs are quite different, and therefore the role that shared mobility would play is quite different. So I don't think it's necessarily for TfL to sort of impose a one-size-fits-all approach to all of the boroughs, but I think what is really important for TfL and London councils to do is to ensure that where we can make things easier, to take away this patchwork. So for those boroughs that are pursuing this as part of their transport strategies, it becomes much easier, and it becomes much easier for operators not having to deal with different contracts, examples that were mentioned, different forms of data sharing agreements, etc. So just coming back to those commitments that I listed out earlier, one of those is very much around working with London councils and working with the boroughs to provide more uniformity across the board. And that can include forms of, shared contractual clauses, like we've been doing with our work-related road risk clauses, for example. That can include best practice or other guidance. So again, very much starting out on this, but I definitely think there's a role for TfL as well as London councils there.
And to what extent is TfL using its power of funding, for example, through its LIP process, to ensure that councils do actually take on board the need to increase shared mobility?
Yep. So in this most recent round of LIP funding, just focusing on this next year, we have really asked boroughs to focus on two areas. One is safe and accessible walking and cycling, and the other one is more reliable and faster bus journey times. And that was really to focus the very limited and uncertain amount of investment that we had. However, in the guidance for the 3-year delivery plans, we do make direct reference to car sharing and how that can contribute, and how boroughs can consider this and implement this to contribute to the overall aims of the MTS. However, we do also set out there that ordinarily we wouldn't seek to provide funding to install bays, for example, but this should be an arrangement between the boroughs and the operators.
Thank you. And with regards to the new funding deal that's just been signed, is that a process that's going to continue in forthcoming years, or is that going to be stepped up? Or can you not say at the moment?
Sorry, could you just clarify your question? What process?
Well, of supporting shared mobility and having perhaps more, I suppose, more stringency in the LIP funding that you give to local boroughs.
So the guidance for the LIP funding that's been set out is for the delivery of the next 3 years. However, within the funding, there is a certain amount funding bill. There is a certain amount allocated to facilitating walking and cycling and other healthy streets measures. And I think we have to see shared mobility. I'm taking car clubs aside here a bit, but around e-scooters and shared bikes as part of that facilitating. Scooting and cycling, so it comes as part of that mix.
Thank you. Tom, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, let me just come back to your first question about that level of coordination and bringing boroughs together. And I think the e-scooter trial provides quite an interesting case study there, because the government provided the option for cities to run trials of rental e-scooters. There was no obligation, and it wasn't clear at what level of government that should be organised. And it was agreed between TfL and ultimately 10 London boroughs that it would make sense for there to be a trial, that it would make sense for it to be consistent and coordinated and organised, and clear roles and responsibilities were set out, and TfL has a series of obligations to the boroughs in terms of the management of that trial. The boroughs have a series of obligations in terms of provision of parking and maintenance of the various traffic regulation orders necessary to fulfil it. The operators have a series of responsibilities to provide consistency, and the whole thing is one contiguous e-scooter zone within London. And that was done on an entirely voluntary basis. So I think it shows that this can be done, but what was helpful there was that there was an overall regulatory framework. So we could all operate within that regulatory framework and define ways of working within that. And I think as we move towards the next stage, that's a model that we would definitely like to continue. And I think I heard earlier the operators saying this has been a really great experience for them. If our borough colleagues were here, I'd hope they'd be saying exactly the same thing, and I suspect they will do when you write to them and ask these questions. So I think we've now, as a result of the e-scooter trial, got a number of principles that we know work and that we can hopefully expand to wider geographies and to a wider range of modes.
Okay, thank you. My other question is, Tom, earlier on, you said that you thought that we could expand, for example, in Outer London, some shared mobility such as bikes and e-bikes relatively easier because they didn't need much funding to get going. But actually, aren't you really going to get people moving to bikes in particular if we do invest quite a bit of money into actually segregated cycle lanes and infrastructure? I mean, if I think of my boroughs of Enfield and Haringey, we do have cycle lanes from the Millie Holland scheme, but they stop at the North Circular Road, and then you're basically stuck and going further in. So I'm just querying your comment that these can be expanded without much funding, because I think actually to get the step change we do need that infrastructure funding.
Absolutely, 100%. So for clarity, I was not saying that we should not be investing in segregated cycle lanes and other provision for cycling. And as Alina said a moment ago, the same infrastructure can benefit e-scooters, bikes, rental bikes, private bikes. All of that is once it's there, it benefits all of those modes. The point I was making is that it doesn't require large amounts of physical infrastructure to install that specific mode. So compared to, for example, building a new tube line, the amount of infrastructure required, and indeed compared to the cycle hire scheme as developed 10 years ago, a rental shared mobility scheme incorporating e-bikes and e-scooters is a very low infrastructure solution, but 100%. We then want to make sure that the quality cycling and scooting infrastructure is available on a much wider scale, and TfL has an outstanding record in the last few years of that.
Okay, and finally on background and strategy issues, Caroline Pidgeon.
Yeah, could I just pick up a couple of things that's come up in the discussion earlier when we were talking about the transport bill. It was suggested almost that the regulation was just going to be for shared schemes. My understanding is any regulations that will come in will include private e-scooters as well. So then we may, as Dr. Cohen said, start to see the rise of hopefully safer e-scooters if they're regularised. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, absolutely. So my understanding is the DFT intends to create a new vehicle class which will incorporate these vehicles. And I think one of the things that is useful about the trial that we've operated is hopefully we can provide some learnings as to what the standards should be, because by virtue of them being illegal, private e-scooters have no standards at the moment at all. And I'm slightly terrified by some of the things that I see for sale in various retailers. Now, one of the questions when we started the e-scooter trial is, can this be a safe mode? Because that wasn't a question we knew the answer to.
Yeah.
And we put in place a whole series of safeguards and provisions that go beyond those nationally mandated by the department to ensure that it was a safe mode in London. So lower speeds, the requirement to larger wheels, the requirement to go slower on the first trip, etc., etc. Now, there's, I think, a bunch of learnings there that the DFT can then use when formulating the standards for private e-scooters as well. But I mean, the great thing is we have proved it can be a safe mode.
Okay, we've got more questions coming up on that, so I'm not going. I just wanted to clarify that legislation. The other issue I wanted to pick up, and Alina, you're the one who mentioned this, is obviously talking about Outer London, ULEZ expansion, the carrot-free zone and all that, which are rather entertaining. But actually, there is potential. Lots of town centres in Outer London where it is dense. I was out in Romford last week. You go to places like East Croydon and so on. So there probably is potential. But you mentioned, Alina, mobility credits, which is something I have talked about for many, many years. Is that a real option, and alongside some sort of scrappage scheme, to really look at mobility credits, so you then open the doors to many people and open their eyes to suddenly car club membership, bike hires, e-scooter, whatever it is. So suddenly there's these options which they may not have considered before. Can you give us a bit more detail of that as part of the background?
Yep. So we are looking at mobility credits under sort of two different strands. One I shall refer to as a more manual system of mobility credits. So this is something that colleagues in city planning are currently actively researching and speaking to operators about in the context of a potential of a scrappage scheme if indeed the mayor confirms to go ahead with a further expansion of the ULEZ. And that was really based on research that was done to evaluate the scrappage scheme for the first expansion of the ULEZ, to understand, what did people do with that scrappage money and what are the alternatives. So actually, rather than just enabling people to own a cleaner vehicle to drive that, actually, wouldn't it be much better if we, at the same point in time where they're giving up a vehicle, could get them to think, actually, is it a new private cleaner vehicle that I need, or are there other options for me? And especially if we can work with car club providers or others to come up with offers that make those options more attractive. So, for example, where it takes you further, essentially, where you might get a cheque for X pounds to use towards a new vehicle, but you would have the equivalent double the value to use for car clubs, for example. So those discussions are actively happening, and if that indeed ULEZ is to be expanded, that would obviously all be communicated. In the much, much longer term, as you're aware, the Mayor has asked us to look at, is there a way to combine existing forms of road user charging into a single integrated scheme? So in the longer term, we're looking at, can this form of mobility credits be made less manual, so that at the point where you're scrapping a vehicle, for example, or where these credits would come into play, you don't have to decide, am I going to get a cleaner vehicle or go for a car club, but actually being able to use those credits interchangeably on different modes. That is very, very early stages, but we're starting to bring together relevant parts of TfL to start that conversation, but also looking at what have people said in that most recent consultation around the future of road user charging, and does it give us any indications there around what people are saying on credits and alternatives.
Thank you. That's really encouraging to hear. I've been talking about this for years, and actually almost hearing what was in my consultation response fed back to me from TfL is very assuring. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're moving on to some rather specific questions about each of the modes in turn. So if the people on the panel can bear that in mind, if you, and this is also true about another mode, we will be asking about the other mode in a moment. So don't deviate too much in your answers. Also, apologies to Assembly Member Desai. I let the questions there drift into the topic of e-scooters too much, so it's fine if he wants to reiterate some of those points in his questions again. So starting with car clubs, therefore, Assembly Member Bailey has questions.
Thank you, Chair, and I direct my first questions to Thomas and TfL, and you might want to jump in. Excuse me. When will a new car club strategy be published?
Well, I'll leave Alina to answer this specifically, but I think overall, we don't intend to publish a car club strategy because we're working towards the Mayor's Transport Strategy. And the Mayor's Transport Strategy outlines our approach overall to what we need to achieve and some principles around car clubs, which Alina mentioned earlier. The key thing is then what we do in terms of delivering the Mayor's Transport Strategy, and that's why we've developed the 6 commitments, so that we can make sure that we're doing things practically that support the delivery of car clubs, but support the delivery of car clubs in such a way that they positively achieve the MTS as opposed to denigrate it. And we heard earlier from some of the things that make the difference between the right outcome and the wrong outcome with regard to the expansion of car clubs.
Yeah, if I just add to that. So yes, we're not planning to develop a car club specific strategy document, but what we have done is set out our vision and set out tangibly how can what is set out in the MTS be made implemented on the ground, and what are our next steps in doing that. We shared that with stakeholders at a round table a couple of months ago, but I'm very happy as part of the follow-up, that document, to share that with you so that you can see what's the evidence that sits behind each of the commitments, and actually also what are our actions and timescales against those actions.
Yeah, I'm sure the Chair will be interested in all of that. Just to say, so what practically are you going to do to help car clubs in particular, because that's my focus here? Where's the Mayor's strategy saying to boroughs? Because much of what happened this morning was people saying, look, there's some will there, but there's a lack of coordination. There's 32 boroughs and we need to get something done. Where is the Mayor on helping that process happen? Because clearly car clubs or any other type of club is not going to exist unless someone provides a focal point for the boroughs to hang on to. So where practically are you going to make changes to the current system to actually deliver something?
So that again really goes back to those 6 commitments and the point that I made, that we don't want to look at driving car club policy forward in isolation, but tying it to other policy areas that are progressing to ensure that it gets the right momentum. So in terms of really practical things, so there's the point around scrappage that I made, scrappage and mobility credits that I made earlier. Then there's a point around supporting and working with London councils to get this new data sharing platform up and running, because that's what we have been told by a lot of stakeholders is a significant barrier. There's also a piece around reviewing public messaging around our policies, where we're talking about alternatives to car use. So in the past, we've very much focused on public transport, walking, cycling, but actually making sure that car clubs and shared cars form part of that. So that focus there is very much on ULEZ comms, but we're also going to do a review of our website to see what more we can do in that space. And then the other practical point is around supporting car club operators with their journey to electrification, which we've heard from Zipcar is an important goal for them. So looking at more effective use of rapid charging points, how can we improve the utilisation and support the sector in that way?
I see what you're saying, but it seems to me it's still missing the sort of basic starter piece that everybody seems to be talking about, is somebody needs to help car clubs cycle clubs, whoever it is, convene better with the boroughs? Don't you think the mayor has a role to play in that, some kind of convening role to get people around the table to get that first initial push to make anything happen? Are you satisfied that you're doing enough practically to get that done?
I think we can always do with more support to get everyone around the table. I think London councils and TfL are, we are doing the best we can. But obviously, if there's other support that can help us with that convening, then that would not be turned away.
I think people are looking to you for that, not for them to support you in that. But that would just be my take. Can I just look? Some car clubs in London have ceased to operate. What do you think was the cause of this, and what can you do to help mitigate that happening even more? I put that to anybody who can come up with that. Probably start with Richard.
Sure. Yes, London has really a checkered history with Car Club. It was a little bit late to the party initially, but only a little. It then did pretty well. And it's since fallen back significantly. And part of that falling back is operational costs, which I think was a factor for all of those car clubs that have ceased to operate here. It's the same point in principle with 2 wheels as well as 4. All this complexity that we're talking about, this lack of integration, that all just means cost if you're an operator. So London is a very expensive city to operate in, the most expensive in the world of its kind for micromobility for sure, and one of the most for shared cars. So obviously that's been a huge issue. With each one, there is also always a background. There are always the decisions being made by the investors or the board of the company involved and so on. So it's not all just down to London, but that complexity and cost, lack of integration. So particularly that boils down to what is your operating patch as a car club operator? Does it make sense? Does it make sense operationally for you? Does it make sense for your users? And of course the two intertwine. Very, very hard to piece that together borough by borough. Takes years of slogging away, and some of them never really manage to get that patch to work. So it's always in the back of my mind as are we going to see any more of this? I think at the moment we have a fairly stable picture. The operators that are left are larger and therefore more likely to be economically sustainable. But I've been talking quite a bit about the headwinds here and the costs and so on. It is a quite challenging environment to be operating in, and a challenging policy one as well. I think it's very welcome the steps TfL are taking now. I don't think they're anything like enough, but I think they're very welcome because I've been in this job 3 and a bit years now. They're far more than anything I've seen in that time to date. So some sense of some progress happening there, but such a long way to go.
Because it seems to me that there's a marked difference between car use in central London than there is in outer London, and I wonder, does that market exist? Will you be able to change enough people's minds to get out of their cars, to get in the car clubs, to make them viable, to make that expansion viable? Because the conversation this morning, the bit I have liked is the idea that all of these modes should be integrated. I'm a bit astonished that we've had to sort of come to that realisation. I would have hoped we'd have started there. But I worry that car club growth in outer London might actually be not viable. It might be impossible. From an emotional point of view, there's more cars out there, so why would I get out of my car? And also from a financial point of view, because nobody's leading this coordination as to how we answer those big problems, so they don't have to be answered 17 times, they're going to be answered once. And that's what I'm looking for TfL and the Mayor's Office to answer, that coordination piece.
Assemblymember Bailey, I'm really sorry, we need to get through quite a few different modes here. So is it possible to wrap up your questioning now? Sorry to be interrupting.
Yeah, I'll get there. What policy changes are needed to better support the MTS goals for car clubs in outer London and generally this mode shift in outer London? I'll start with TfL.
So I think the overarching point to make there is that in outer London, in a situation where you possibly have a driveway, you possibly have free parking, what is the incentive to give up your car? Which is why the way the MTS sets us out, that in order for car clubs to be able to grow and reduce private car use and thereby trips, they need to be combined with other measures that reduce parking or other traffic reduction measures, because otherwise there isn't incentive enough to give up your car simply by seeing a car club vehicle on your street. So hence the combination of potential ULEZ expansion plus car clubs and scrappage, for example, or other measures looking at a wider car parking reduction across outer London, for example. That's obviously, again, very much sits with the boroughs rather than TfL, which brings us back to a coordinating point. But I think the overarching point is that the introduction or growth of car clubs needs to be combined with other measures that reduce parking and traffic.
Okay. And Thomas, my final question to you is, Richard talked about the increase in pace in the help that you're providing for car clubs, and that sounds like a good thing. But do you think this should have all been done earlier?
I don't know. I'm comparatively new to TfL myself, so I think I'll start from the position of looking forwards. I think that the point that Alina made a moment ago, though, is a really important one, which is that this needs to be done in parallel with other things, because club cars are still cars. Therefore, they can provide a really useful role in helping people move from private car journeys to shared car journeys as part of a wider ecosystem of trips. But those car journeys are still being made by car. So it's got to be part of a wider package of measures. So if you go to the very other extreme, for example, if someone makes a journey by bus or walking or bike, that's a journey that, unambiguously, if that journey has made, we can be confident that we have moved towards the goals that we've set. Now, with car clubs, it's a slightly different situation. Therefore, it is a more complex policy landscape to make sure that we're pulling the right levers and we're encouraging car clubs in achieving the right goals. And I think there's been a certain amount of deliberation to make sure that those 6 commitments are those that will deliver the right outcomes. And one of the questions regarding micromobility, which we'll come on to, is to make sure that we've got the right levers there as well, which is slightly further along the spectrum for all the reasons. Micromobility doesn't take up space, car club cars do, etc. So I think car clubs are a more complex policy landscape to make sure that you're not just growing car clubs, but growing car clubs to achieve the right outcomes.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Right, so I'm passing over now to Assembly Member Rogers to ask about bike sharing specifically.
Thank you. My question is specifically around Dockless bikes. I'm going to direct it at TfL. We heard in the first session from the providers, and I mean, talking about coordination, it seemed that there was quite a sort of lack of joined-up thinking across London, but there had been some attempts to coordinate. There's the code of practice and a potential bylaw that's been talked about for a while. But in the meantime, it seems that the providers are just kind of getting on with it themselves. They're talking to individual boroughs who are willing, and they're entering into deals with those boroughs. But that seems to be leading to different types of models, parking models, for example, floating models for some, parking bay models for others. Do you think it's fair to say that there has been a lack of coordination, London-wide coordination on Dockless bikes, and what are your proposals to address that?
I think evidently the situation that we're in at the moment is one in which there is a huge degree of inconsistency, and that leads to consumer confusion. And as I said earlier, it also potentially leads to cost and restricts the availability of these models on a wider basis. It's certainly not through lack of effort. As you mentioned, the bylaw has existed for many years, long before I joined TfL, and never made it to becoming an actual bylaw and therefore achieving the goals. So there was an effort at coordination, but the coordination didn't materialise as actual coordination. It's one of the reasons why I think the e-scooter trial has provided a useful model, and one of the reasons why I think the likelihood of the department legislating to enable city authorities to take on that coordinating role is a really good thing. And the boroughs who've been part of the e-scooter trial have really valued that coordinating role that TfL have taken on, because it makes the whole model, the model makes sense for everyone, including within each of the participating boroughs. So yes, there has been a significant lack of coordination looking backwards. There's a significant lack of coordination right now, but I'm feeling a lot more optimistic about the situation going forwards.
Thank you. So, I mean, it must be that you're getting pushback from certain boroughs who perhaps just don't want dockless bikes. So what kind of pushback are you getting? What issues are boroughs raising for why they perhaps don't want to engage on this?
I mean, I haven't had a significant degree of pushback to me personally since I joined, but I think most of the discussion on the bylaw was before I joined. And I think part of the challenge is just that if you have 33 different sets of policymakers, people make decisions at different times, people focus on different issues at different times, and for something like the bylaw, you need everyone to be ready to make the same decision at the same moment in time. And actually, it can sometimes not even be a lack of willingness. It can just be, it just doesn't happen like that. That's not how the world works, which is why there needs to be a level over the top to make sure that that coordination can be applied. And as I say, it also helps us think about the micromobility modes collectively as opposed to individually, so it has that wider benefit as well.
And without straying into the specific issue of e-scooters, can you see lessons learned from the e-scooter trial being applied then to dockless bikes?
Yes, absolutely. I think we're learning those lessons and applying those lessons now. The governance model, I'm not saying it'll be a lift and shift. It absolutely won't be a straightforward lift and shift, but I think there's a lot of lessons about how to work, where the responsibilities should sit at different levels, and just the benefits to the end user of that level of coordination that absolutely we'll seek to apply into that market as well.
Interesting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And now some questions from Assembly Member Sheikh. Calling you for the first time, apologies for that, with further questions on bike sharing.
No apologies needed, Chair. I wasn't due to speak before now. Thank you, though. Yeah, they're just following on from Assembly Member Rogers' questions around sort of bike sharing and the consequences of it in London. And I'll address my question to Alina, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and Thomas. Just regarding sort of the need for this sort of wider strategy and kind of, I guess, London is getting used to it, but also ensuring that the way that we implement it is accessible and affects Londoners, or doesn't disproportionately affect Londoners negatively, for instance, particularly disabled Londoners. So in the context of sort of dockless bikes, what is being done, to your knowledge, on preventing them blocking pavements and creating, obviously at times it can be a nuisance to access pavements, but also it can be a really serious issue when it comes to disabled Londoners being able to move through pavements. So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually experienced this exact issue personally yesterday when I was walking home from work, and I realised that the pavement that I was walking along was blocked by a shared e-bike, and that there was a wheelchair user about 30 yards further down the same street. And luckily, I was able to hoik it out of the way and move it and clear the pavement before he reached that side. And he wasn't inconvenienced. But clearly, that's not a situation that should occur. And it's something that, as part of the e-scooter trial, we agreed with the boroughs and the operators that we would have designated parking bays. They would be lined, they would be signed. They would exist as a result of traffic regulation orders that made sure that parking only took place in those locations. And the operators would geofence to ensure that vehicles couldn't be parked anywhere else. And that has worked. So the great thing is we have some likely ways forward on this, but that hasn't been the case for the shared e-bike model. It's worth noting that the vast majority of e-bike users do park responsibly, but the problem is you only need a handful who don't to cause an awful lot of inconvenience. So we haven't made any definite decisions about the future of any form of integration of these models, but it seems to me likely that we would be looking at some form of dedicated, bayed, lined and signed parking model, because we've proved through the e-scooter trial that can work, and it mitigates a lot of the issues which are very real and which affect Londoners on a daily basis.
No, that's really positive to hear. And what is it that you think would stop you from doing that?
I can't think of anything. We obviously need the legislation to continue its journey through Parliament. That's at relatively early stages. I don't foresee any significant issues with that. And then for the appropriate regulations to be delegated by Department for Transport to us. We're in dialogue with them on a regular basis. Again, I don't foresee any issues there as well. And as I say, when you heard the operator speaking earlier about the experience of the scooter trial, I think that they found that a positive experience. So I don't actually see that should be a significant challenge. I think one thing it is worth noting, though, is we do need, therefore, to work with our borough colleagues to make sure the density of parking is right, because the flip side to not having the ability to park anywhere is that a user needs to know there will be somewhere nearby that they can park. And there's plenty of available space that makes sense, especially if you consider parking spaces to be potential cycle hire, e-scooter, e-bike parking locations. And there's lots of available space. We just need to make sure that that space is available, so that if you have a future micromobility scheme or schemes in some form, that density of parking is available, so that it becomes a practical option for people.
Well, I think that's all really positive to hear, and the emphasis that I think that kind of infrastructure does need to be accommodated. So the wider kind of Dockless bike code of practice, could you talk a little bit about the impact it's had and how it's being enforced, maybe the positives and negatives of things for improvement?
Yeah, I mean, it's TfL doesn't have any regulatory power in this area, so the code of practice is an attempt to use the convening power that we have. The vast majority of bike hire operators who have entered London have complied with it, especially in recent years. There are 4 shared e-bike operators in London at the moment. All of them are complying with the code of practice. 3 of them are the same operators who operate the e-scooter trial. So there's a degree of commonality there. But clearly, a code of practice isn't the same as having the level of consistency and enforceable consistency that we have, for example, through the e-scooter trial. So I think it's been a good thing to have, but it's not the same as the direction of travel we would like to take looking forward.
And specifically when it hasn't been followed by any of those who've signed up to it, where are the weaknesses?
The sense that I've had is that the majority of operators have sought to comply with the code of practice, and the challenges have been things like the situation I described earlier. When I was on my way home yesterday was an operator who had signed up to the code of practice, and I've no doubt if that bike had sat there long enough, someone would have come and moved it. But fundamentally, at that moment in time, there was a Londoner who needed to access that pavement at that moment, and they couldn't wait. So I think the issues aren't really with the enforcement of the code of practice, it's the limitations of what the code of practice says. The code of practice says what we felt was possible to say at the time in the context of what is ultimately a voluntary arrangement, which is why having a more defined role for TfL that gives us the ability to coordinate across London will be a better arrangement than the one we've had in the past.
Okay, thank you. That leads me nicely on to my next question, which is about the current strategy for the development of bike sharing in London. How is this being formulated? What does it look like?
So we're in quite an interesting position in London at the moment because we have 3 different models, one of which is the bike hire scheme that TfL operates entirely in-house, one of which is the shared e-bike market, which is operated entirely through third-party operators, independently and unregulated, and in the middle you've got the e-scooter trial. So we've got a lot of lessons that we can draw. So what we are doing at the moment is seeking to learn lessons from all 3 of those operating models and what works. So e-bikes, you have the benefit of huge amounts of innovation, and things like the ability to geofence. If that technology didn't exist, we wouldn't be able to say to our borough colleagues that you can prevent vehicles being used in places where you don't want them, in parks and squares where you don't want them. So that level, we don't want to stifle the level of innovation. At the other extreme, obviously, with the cycle hire model, we have total control as TfL, but probably a slower pace of innovation. And so it's trying to balance all of those. We're engaging very closely with the market. We've run 2 market sounding questionnaires this year to try to understand what the market can deliver and where we should therefore try to pitch the future model. And we've also continued to engage closely with Londoners, and especially Londoners who may have diverse needs. So we ran a number of stakeholder events with regard to accessibility, and especially accessibility of the micromobility market, to understand what we could and should be doing differently. And then there's a whole bunch of thinking, and a lot of thinking taking place internally as to where we should land all this, what the future model should look like. But this is a fast evolving landscape. So while thinking, we're continuing to learn lessons.
Yeah, no, that sounds like an exciting process, to be honest, and I'm sure the committee would be interested to be continue to stay updated on that, and particularly pleased to hear about the kind of work you're doing with Londoners to ensure that their voices are heard in it, particularly around the issues of accessibility. And I'm always a fan of hearing a lot more detail when it comes to like what that engagement looks like on a practical level. So you're more than welcome to follow that up with the committee afterwards in writing, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Be very
perhaps
happy.
the groups that you're reaching out to, how many sessions, and even the findings from them would be really interesting. I just got, sorry.
No, I'm very happy to do that because there is quite a lot there, there were some really useful findings. And also just to reiterate, I'm more than happy to come back to the committee and talk you through our conclusions or emerging conclusions as we get further through this process of developing our thinking as the future models.
Looking forward to it. I'll just finish on my final question, which is what policy changes are needed to make bike sharing better support the Mayor's transport strategy goals?
I think to an extent we've probably covered it. The changes that are expected through the transport bill will give the city authorities, including TfL, the ability to set that overarching framework, which is crucial. We then need to make sure that we use that to ensure comprehensibility for Londoners, to ensure integration across the public transport network, because people don't make journeys in isolation, they make them multimodally, and to see if we can find ways of delivering these models more efficiently by not treating them as entirely independent when actually they have a whole load of commonality between them.
Thank you. I was just going to say I might bring our other guests in on policy changes that they might suggest. Richard and then Tom.
Thank you. Just to be clear, the powers that may be put into the transport bill and probably the secondary legislation hanging off it, if that does all happen, will be a game changer for London. So this would give TfL the ability to licence operators, which is a big step. It's how most comparable cities do it, so it's not a step out into the wild. I think it's a very sensible step. In the meantime, we have our accreditation of CoMoUK. We are an accrediting body of operators. We have the Code of Conduct, which was largely a thing of its time when Dockless Bike Share first landed in London, an attempt to set some rules quickly in place. It's fairly easy for operators to meet, and we've had the failed adventure over 2 years of the bylaw, which I think is effectively now dead. So in this interim period, before whatever legislation comes in, which is, think of roughly 2 years, might be longer, then we're trying to work hard, and I think quite productively behind the scenes with TfL in particular, but also LC and boroughs and operators, as to what can we do that's better, and some meetings are taking place on that as a regular series. It's not easy, but I think it's important we don't just sit around for the next 2 years and say that legislation is going to fix it, because it's very much semi-broken at the moment. You know, this is not going very well. Just to draw on the e-scooter trial and parking and that aspect of policy. So you can have the e-scooter trial come in. It's been a big step forwards. It really is a super case study to lean on. It's a big move for London. But it doesn't have anything like enough parking.
I don't want to cut you off, but I think
we are still on bikes. Yeah, I'm trying to separate this by mode.
I'm coming to bikes. So it's an example. There's nothing like enough parking in that trial. So in other words, with bikes, you can still have these new powers be created. You will still come to this borough TfL interface, and how do we have enough space given over to these sustainable modes on the ground in a way that works for users? That challenge will still be there.
Thank you, Richard. And Tom?
Thank you. Briefly, my perception is that Transport for London is not yet convinced that shared bikes have a massive part to play. I'm ready to be contradicted, but my reading of it is that they are happy to wait and watch as the market does what it does. And that seems to have been implicit in much of the conversation so far today. So the market's going to continue to run shared bikes in London, and for as long as that's the case, it's going to be very hard to control what happens. And contrasted, if you like, with the bus situation, we have franchising in London, we have deregulation elsewhere, and it's not hard to see the difference. So if we wished to see rented bikes playing a very major role in the pursuit of the MTS objectives, that would point to a much more regulated system than we have, and I suspect a much more regulated system than is likely or wanted.
Thank you, Tom. Thomas, before I bring you back in, I'm actually going to give that choice to the chair, because I know we are behind on time, and if the chair's agreeable to the follow-up information, that'd be great.
I think we are within a matter of minutes of needing to close the meeting, and it has been really difficult, sorry to members, it's been really difficult to separate the modes and ask people to talk about each one in between, and that was probably my error in setting the schedule for the meeting. Assembly Member Desai, I think most of your questions on e-scooters have been stepped over really badly, but I think there is a follow-up we want to ask about. Do you want to ask the first question in that session, and anything you've got in your supplementaries, very briefly, because we do need to just ask one more final question at the end.
I think, sorry.
We have 8 minutes.
8 minutes. Yeah, okay. I mean, I had 3 questions to ask of your panel, but I think one of the 3 questions has already partially been answered in response to a question from Assembly Pigeon. But I want to ask about the enforcement side of things in terms of e-scooters. So this is to TfL. What lessons have you learnt about the enforcement of e-scooters from the trials?
Just before I answer that, I will just... Tom said he was happy to be contradicted, so I would just like to contradict him. With regard to enforcement, I think there's a number of things. The first is that the private e-scooter market is unregulated, uncontrolled, unlicensed, and there are no standards. So the level of enforcement required at the moment is very high because there are no rules. So the changes that are being made through the Transport Bill in terms of creating a new vehicle class for e-scooters, enabling there to be retail standards, enabling there to be vehicle standards, and therefore hopefully moving to a situation where if you see an e-scooter on the street, you can have a certain degree of confidence that it's safe, and that it may have a speed limit, and various things like that will reduce the enforcement burden. We're at quite a tricky time at the moment because almost by definition, if an e-scooter is out there, it's being used illegally. Therefore, that means that the person using it is happy to use it illegally. Once the e-scooter market is legalised, you hopefully will start to see different vehicles and different behaviours. So what I would like to see is a market that works and therefore needs less enforcement. As you know, we as TfL had to ban e-scooters from our transport network because of the safety standards of those vehicles. So that's clearly not a situation that makes sense. But it was the right thing to do at the time. Therefore, that needs to be dealt with through regulation.
And I mean, how do you work with the Metropolitan Police and also the City of London Police as part of the trial?
Absolutely. So we work very closely with the Metropolitan Police and the City Police. All the scooters that are part of the trial have serial numbers on them, so they can be identified as a trial vehicle and therefore a vehicle that is permitted to be on London streets. Metropolitan Police have done a huge amount of work in trying to enforce the distinction between rental e-scooters and private e-scooters. But the situation that exists at the moment is not an ideal one, where you have one type of vehicle out there that is allowed to be out there and another type of vehicle out there that is completely uncontrolled. That is, we are in an extreme position at the moment in terms of that distinction. And what I'd like to get to a situation is where they're much closer together, so the enforcement burden becomes less.
Chair, I think I'll leave it at that, bearing in mind the time. But I think there was a question about government policy.
We've had lots of policy ideas. The one thing, though, I mean, the trial itself, we were trying to time this meeting to come after the end of the trial. It's been extended a number of times. I think we are really interested to see the road danger, the enforcement, any interim findings that you might have. Are you able to release those, or are you just going to have to hang on until the end of the trial?
So the trial, the e-scooter trial, is actually ultimately a DFT trial, and so the majority of the data goes to the DFT. So they, I know, have plans to publish a post-trial series of data. We can certainly publish what we have, though some of it we don't have access to. Some of it goes straight from the operators to.
But what you have, like in terms of police data, for example,
absolutely.
Could we have that in as a committee to look at? Because this is
absolutely very, very happy fantastic. To do so.
Okay, members, we are now within 4 minutes of the close of the meeting. So huge apologies to Assemblymember Pigeon, who wanted to ask about mobility hubs. Again, can I ask you to make a formal request for written information on that, Assemblymember Pigeon?
Yeah, sure. I was going to be talking to Richard and Dr. Curran about mobility hubs and their potential benefits and why they haven't been introduced in London and what policy changes are needed for this sort of better integration between shared transport we've been discussing, whatever we mean by shared, which I like to return to there, and public transport. So if we could pick that up afterwards, so particularly Richard and Tom, I wanted to hear from on that. We're told there's a pilot in Redbridge. I hadn't heard of that one. Greenwich, there have been. So let's, if we could pick that up, I'd really like, and if you've got any international examples on that. And I think also, Chair, we ought to write to London councils, because actually I can't remember, certainly this term, anyone from London councils turning up to any of our meetings, either tech members or their officers. And, you know, they're a big piece in this puzzle, so perhaps we can pick that up as well.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, we were hoping they would be here, but they did not come. I think I need to close the meeting now. However, just a very final word to Tom, if that's okay. Yes or no? Do you think there's a case for there being a shared mobility overall strategy for London? We've heard from TfL they won't do a car club strategy on its own, like because it's too much in isolation. But is there a case for separating out shared mobility or not? Because that's, I think.
As an academic, you would expect me to equivocate, so allow me to do exactly that. Depending on the quality of the strategy, absolutely. If it has intelligent, clear thinking in it, it will be useful.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you very, very much. Now, I'm just trying to find the very end of my meeting. Okay, thank you to our guests. Can I ask, it was really interesting, we will write to you for more information. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Noted. And can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Thank you. Can we note our work programme and future meetings? Noted. Section 7. The next meeting is scheduled for the 11th of October at 10 o'clock here in City Hall. And the final item is for me to say there is no urgent business. So thank you very much, members, for all your patience. Thank you to the guests for all the information. And we hope to receive some more. Thank you. Bye.